Christmas at the Cove. Heartwarming women's fiction. Five Island Cove, Book 4. Written by Jessie Newton. Narrated by Jill Smith. Chapter 1. A.J. Proctor took off the red and white striped sweater with a muttered, "This makes you look like a chubby candy cane." She'd put on a few pounds since she'd quit her job at the sports network a couple of weeks ago. Perhaps she'd left the station a month ago, but she really had only gained about 5 pounds. She was happier than she'd been in a long time, and she knew it was because of a trifecta of things all combining together to increase her overall mood. 1. She was now seriously dating Matt Hymas. Yes, he still lived in Five Island Cove, and she still lived in New York, but he came to see her every chance he got, and she'd been back to the Cove several times in the past few months since they'd reconnected. 2. AJ had started seeing a therapist. She wasn't sure why she'd been so resistant to meeting with a mental health professional, only that she'd once believed that admitting she needed help was the worst form of weakness she could exhibit. She now knew her father was wrong. All of the coaches she'd had over the years were wrong. She herself had been wrong. There was nothing wrong with getting the help she needed to be the best, most whole, and healthiest version of herself that she could be. It was Dr. Genosi that had kept AJ in New York, actually. If not for the progress AJ had been making with her therapist, she strongly suspected she'd have already made the move back to the Cove. At the same time, AJ did not really want to move back to Five Island Cove. That was the topic of today's therapy session, and AJ pulled off her sweater and tossed it on her bed. She needed to make the right decisions for her about Five Island Cove. Not because Matt lived there and she'd already fallen for him all over again. He was precisely the kind of man she'd always wanted to look her way. Had she known he would respect her, show up on time, and hold her when she was uncertain, only providing suggestions if she asked for them, she'd have answered his telephone calls in the months following her departure from the Cove. Matt had gone to college, too, right here in New York City, and he'd tried calling her in Miami a few times. She'd had her roommate screen those calls, because she'd been running from the first 18 years of her life. She didn't know how sick she was. She truly didn't believe anyone could love her. Sometimes she still felt like she was running, and still trying to believe she had any worth to anyone. AJ peered into her closet, which in the apartment she rented was about the size of a kitchen cabinet and couldn't be called a closet at all, trying to find something else to wear. She reached for the same black floral blouse she'd been wearing everywhere lately and tugged it over her head. It at least lay so it wasn't obvious that she'd gained a few pounds. She needed to stop eating so much pasta, but she lived above the noodle factory, and it was so easy to stop there on her way back from the gym in the morning, and even easier at night when she finished writing her columns in the shared workspace she rented on the next block over. That was the third reason she was so blissfully happy. Her new career as a freelance sports columnist. She could finally get credit for all the contacts she had, all the stories she dug up, and all the knowledge of sports she'd acquired over the years. She'd had no problem selling her columns. As it was, she was booked out for the next 3 months, as the basketball regular season had just begun, and all football fans everywhere were gearing up for bowl games on the collegiate level, and then the Super Bowl in just 6 weeks. Everyone wanted to know everything about their favorite athlete's training schedule and what they did to stay mentally strong through playoffs and stressful games, and their personal habits to rejuvenate in their off-season downtime. AJ hadn't had to call in any personal favors yet, and she was making twice as much as she had writing the stories for the on-air talent at her network. It's also a job you can do from the Cove, she thought, as she quickly stepped into her boots and reached for her coat. She wasn't sure why the thought was there. She had never wanted to return to the Cove permanently. Just 8 months ago, she'd only gone for Joel's funeral out of sheer obligation. So much had changed since April, and AJ wasn't sorry about any of it. Down on the street, her stomach lurched as she lifted her arm to get a cab. She'd forgotten to eat again, But she reassured herself that Wendy, the woman who sat next to AJ in the shared workspace, would have snacks on her desk. She never minded sharing, and she even brought in the dried apricot and mango that AJ had sampled once and really enjoyed just to offer it to AJ. She'd head to the Creative Commons after her session, and she'd be able to eat then. She watched the city go by, seeing images of her life on the windows and walls of the tall buildings. College, which had been one big disappointment, though she'd graduated. Her failure to make the Olympic track team. Her decline into more men for a year, until she cleaned herself up and got a job in sports broadcasting. Her return to college, this time with an emphasis on broadcasting and journalism. Her graduation. Her long relationships that led to dead ends. Robin, Alice, Eloise, Kelly, the women who never truly left her, and who'd always accepted her for exactly who she was. A smile touched her face, and AJ blinked. The images disappeared, and the city became just the city again. "Lexington Building," the cab driver said, and AJ quickly tapped her watch to pay for the ride. Outside, she zipped her coat to her chin and started down the cleared sidewalk. Mother Nature had not been kind this first week of December, and she often felt like an insect bustling through paths with high walls of snow on either side. Heat greeted her upon opening the door, bursting into her face with the scent of flames and vanilla. The receptionist at the front desk always burned candles, and AJ had started to purchase some of the brand for herself. They were all hand-created, with creative names and scents, from a female-owned business out of California. "What's this variety?" she asked Raymond as she signed into the building. "Take a chill," he said. "Vanilla bean ice cream, long naps, and marshmallow dreams." He grinned at her as he turned the jar toward her. AJ read the same description, a smile crossing her face, too. "I got the boyfriend's sweater one. I love it." "Darby loves that one, too," Ray said, taking the check-in clipboard and pressing the button to let her into the building. AJ didn't immediately move toward the door, though if she didn't pass through it in the next 60 seconds, Ray would have to open it for her again. "She does, huh? And you two are engaged yet?" "I'm working on it," Ray said, not meeting AJ's eye. "Are you?" AJ had loved getting to know Ray, and he made it very easy to do that, as he could talk the ear off a deaf man. "What's the holdup?" She was at least a decade older than Ray and his girlfriend, but she'd heard a lot about the two of them in the past 3 months since she'd been coming to the Lexington Building to meet with Dr. Genosi. "The holdup is Darby said she's not sure she wants to get married." Ray looked up then, and AJ's heart tore for him. "Oh, no," she said. "Get on out here and hug me." Ray shook his head, a small smile on his face as he did what AJ said. He was a sharp dresser, his hair always combed just so. She thought him a good catch for someone lucky enough to find him, and she couldn't fathom why his girlfriend didn't want to marry him. She wasn't going to be like Robin, though, and ask. A question did bounce through her mind, but she kept it silent. She'd been on the wrong end of it before, and she would not put another person through the emotional turmoil of wondering if Darby didn't want to get married in general, or if she simply didn't want to marry Raymond. Nathan hadn't wanted to marry AJ, and that had been a painful realization that she'd already worked through with her therapist. "Thanks, AJ," Ray said, his voice muted and so unlike his own. He stepped back and kept his face turned away from hers as he returned to his desk. "Go on, so I don't have to open the door again." "Okay," AJ said, stepping toward the door. She didn't move very fast, adding, "Ray, call me if you need to, okay?" "Yep," he said, already back in his seat. AJ went through the door to the bank of elevators that led up to at least a dozen medical offices, knowing Ray wouldn't call her. They were friendly, and they had exchanged numbers, but she saw him once a week. She didn't really know him. AJ thought about the people who she did know, and who knew her. If she needed help, She didn't need to call Ray or Wendy. She'd call Kelly first, who'd probably alert Eloise or Robin, and the entire Seafaring Girls group would know within minutes. She swiped on her phone as the elevator took her to the 16th floor and checked the group text string the 5 of them had started months ago. Nothing new. And Eloise's message about how the inn would be ready for her holiday guests was the last one. AJ had read it an hour ago, when it had come in, and she hadn't wanted to be the first to respond. Since no one else had either, she assumed she wasn't the only one who didn't want to be the first to confirm they'd be in the Cove for Christmas and that she couldn't wait to see the Cliffside Inn in all its glory. She had no hesitation about going. Her plane ticket was already booked, and she'd already made several plans with Matt. She'd love to gush over the inn, too. Last time the 5 of them had gotten together over the summer, they'd assigned meals and planned activities together. Someone would need to spearhead all of that, and it shouldn't have to be Eloise just because they would gather at the inn for a night or two. Or Alice, because she owned that huge house on Rocky Ridge. AJ could see herself doing it, because her articles for the College Bowl games were already outlined. All she had to do was wait to see who won, get a couple of quotes, make some minor adjustments, and they'd be done. As the elevator dinged her arrival, she quickly sent, "Thank you, Elle. I'll put together a meal schedule, okay? Unless anyone has any objections, I can do activities too, since Matt and I already looked into everything happening around the Cove during the holidays." She'd barely given her name and sat down to wait before a flurry of texts arrived.
"Thanks, AJ,"
Alice had said.
"With the upcoming move, I'm so scattered."
"No objections," Kelly had said. "We'll be a day early to see the inn, Eloise, if that's okay."
"Take it away, AJ,"
Robin had said, ever the cheerleader of the group. AJ smiled at all of them, wondering why no one wanted to text first. She couldn't quite pinpoint why she hadn't wanted to either, and she looked up, trying to examine her feelings and make sense of them. "AJ," Dr. Genosi said, and she looked toward the door where the woman stood. "I'm ready for you." AJ smiled back at her, ready to do this too. She needed to determine whether or not she could return to the Cove the way her other friends had, and if that was in her best interest, and not because she felt left out. A week later, AJ disembarked from the plane and hustled through the wind to get inside the airport on Diamond Island. At least it's not raining, she thought, because she'd been in the slanted, sideways rain that plagued Five Island Cove in the winter, and it wasn't pleasant. It could be as sharp as needles and as cold as ice, and a booming clap of thunder filled the sky as she stepped inside the airport. Cries rose up, and AJ suspected the people in the waiting areas had been there for a while and would be staying a little longer. Planes didn't take off in the driving rainstorms, and it was cold enough today to produce snow. Sure enough, when she arrived at baggage claim, an announcement sounded through the whole airport. "All planes have been grounded for the next 90 minutes, a male voice said. He continued to talk over the groans of those who wanted to leave the Cove and the relieved conversations of those who'd made it in. AJ wasn't sure how to feel. She'd come to the Cove 2 weeks early, and not for a reason she wanted anyone to know about. She'd seen Dr. Genosi yesterday, but she'd already changed her plane ticket and packed her bag at that point. Meeting with the therapist had only confirmed what AJ knew to be right. She hadn't told a single person she was coming today, not even the man she'd come to see. Her pulse fluttered in her throat, not strong enough to choke her. She'd been through that debilitating feeling of losing everything already, and it was time to do something about it. After lifting her own bags from the belt, she went toward the rideshare line, hoping that wouldn't be too delayed, though she knew it would be. Her mind raced, as it had been doing for the past 3 days since she'd learned of her condition. She'd been working through so much since then. Flight changes, laundry, submitting a couple of articles early and pulling others, packing, flying. "Ma'am?" the attendant said, and she clued in. The man already stood at the back door of a sedan, waiting for her to take the rideshare. "Thanks," she said. He helped her with the bags, and gratitude filled AJ. She didn't want to lift them into the trunk, and she hoped the driver could help her once she arrived at her destination. A woman sat behind the wheel, and AJ's hopes withered slightly. "Where to?" the driver asked, a pretty smile on her face. She eased away from the curb before AJ could comprehend the question. "Oh, 74 Hillshire Drive," she said, her stomach and chest rioting against what she was doing. But it had to be done. The drive didn't take long. Or maybe AJ had zoned out again. She didn't need to take her luggage to the door, but she didn't have anywhere else to store it. She probably should have gone to the hotel first, but she hadn't allowed herself to even think of it. If she didn't just tell him, she was worried she'd chicken out. The driver did help her with the bags, and then AJ faced the simple yet stylish house that sat only 2 blocks from the beach. The rain had definitely driven Matt indoors, and he'd told her once that he didn't stay at the clubhouse if he didn't have to. "He'll be home," she whispered to herself as she towed her suitcases up his front sidewalk. She'd just stepped under the protection of the eaves when the rain started. She tugged her biggest suitcase out of the way and reached to knock. He'd tried to replace the doorbell a month or so ago, but he'd ended up shorting out the whole assembly and hadn't gotten back to it yet, so she knew she couldn't press the button and get any results. AJ's knuckles against the door sounded like gunshots to her own ears, and she only rapped 4 times. With all the rain and thunder, perhaps Matt wouldn't hear her. Her fingers shook, as did her chin, and she told herself it was just because of the cold temperatures in 5 Island Cove. Matt didn't answer, and AJ's thoughts scattered again. She'd tried, right? She could just go get warm in the hotel now. No. She shook her head and knocked again. Only a few seconds later, the door opened, and Matt stood there. Handsome, tall, refined, mature Matthew Hymas. "AJ," he said, clearly surprised. A smile touched his mouth as he stepped back. "Come in out of the rain, come in." He didn't ask what she was doing there. He reached to help her with her luggage. He closed the door behind her and drew her into a tight embrace, the fabric of his polo soft and slick against her skin. What a great surprise. His voice was soft and tender in her ear, his voice rumbling from his chest to hers. All of her fears evaporated because he was so perfect. He could handle what she needed to tell him. "What are you doing here?" AJ drew in a breath, realizing how shakily it entered her lungs. "I have to tell you something," she said. She stepped back because she needed to see his face when she told him. All of her worries returned because she and Matt had already spoken about this topic, and his desires were crystal clear. Matt, I don't know how to say this, so I guess I'll just say it." She looked him right in the eye and exhaled, the air sort of sounding like a nearly silent machine gun. "I'm pregnant, Matt. The baby is yours." A baby he'd told her he didn't want. When he just stood there, saying nothing, doing nothing, barely even breathing and blinking, extreme foolishness filled AJ. After all, she was 45 years old, and she knew how to make sure this particular brand of unexpectedness didn't happen. "I'm sorry," she said, tears filling her eyes. Everything inside her broke, and she realized then that Dr. Genosi had been right to be cautious. AJ had somehow created a fantasy out of Matt's reaction, and he hadn't given her what she'd conjured in her mind. Her tears spilled down her face, and that was finally when Matt wrapped her up in his arms again and let her cry against his shoulder. He didn't say anything, though, and AJ really hated reality in that moment. Finally, he whispered, "Shh, Ava Jane, don't be sorry." And those were the best words AJ had ever heard in her entire life. Chapter 2. Robin Grover added the red cooking dye to the chocolate cake batter and got the mixer going again. Her husband, Duke, loved red velvet cake, and it was his birthday today. The girls would be home from school in an hour, about the same time the cake came out of the oven. Mandy, her oldest, would frost the cake once it cooled, and together they'd decorate the house for the party they'd have when Duke came home from fishing. He didn't go out every day in the winter because the seas could be rough, and his boat was starting to get up there in age. He used her relentlessly, and she'd gone all the way to Alaska and back this summer. Robin thought of Garrett Hall and his threats from a few months ago. He had a way of creeping into her mind at the most inopportune times, but she hadn't been able to shake him completely. To her knowledge, AJ had not been fired or lost her job. She'd quit of her own volition, and she claimed to be doing better with her freelance writing than her job at the station. She'd never gotten an on-air position, but Robin had no idea if Garrett had been responsible for that or not. Duke's boat had not been sunk or vandalized. Kelly hadn't heard from or seen Zach again. Alice had not lost her home. Eloise was still engaged and finishing up all the finer details at the inn. The 5 seafaring girls and their families would be staying there for a few days before the holidays to test out the rooms, the systems, the kitchen, all of it. It would be a good trial run for Eloise, and then she'd be ready to open the inn for Christmas. Robin put her fears out of her mind, because there was nothing she could do about them anyway. She poured the cake batter into the greased and floured cake pans and slid them into the oven. With a timer set, Robin got busy cleaning up the mess she'd made. She didn't work nearly as much in the winter either, though her spring wedding prep would start the moment the holidays ended. She had 5 brides who wanted the perfect wedding, Eloise being one of them. Robin would do everything in her power to make every event memorable and as easy as possible for the people who'd hired her. But she still had time to bake a cake for her husband's birthday. The girls had picked out simple presents for him, and Robin had wrapped them after he'd taken them to school and continued on to the dock. The gifts sat on the dining room table, and once the kitchen was clean, Robin went to get her present for him from her office. Mandy had bought his favorite candy, dark chocolate-covered almonds, in bulk, and Jamie had used some of her babysitting money to get him a gift card from the Polish dog food truck that frequented the docks as the fishermen came in off their boats. Duke actually liked their breakfast dog the best, and his weakness was getting breakfast on the way out for a day of trawling. Robin had purchased a new pair of gloves for him, along with a brand new set of walkie-talkies. He loved his radios to communicate with his friends on the other boats, as they usually went out in groups to the best fishing grounds. Brian Reynolds and Duke were good friends, and Robin could always count on Brian to have her husband's back. She quickly wrapped the gloves and the walkie-talkies, put them beside the other gifts, and got the cream cheese out of the fridge so it could start to soften. Her phone rang, and her mother's name sat on the screen. Robin's heart dipped down to her stomach, but she answered the call anyway. "Mom, hey," she said, hoping she sounded reasonably normal. "Robin, dear, I have a gift for Duke." "Oh, of course." Robin had not invited her mother to their family celebration. She had been trying to improve things with her mother, and for the first time in her life, Robin had what she'd classify as a real relationship with her mom. It certainly wasn't perfect, but they'd both been trying. There had been apologies and honest conversations, and while Robin didn't choose her mother as the person she wanted to spend the most time with, they definitely got along better. "You can just bring it to the party on Sunday," she said. "I'm not going to be here on Sunday," her mother said. "I'm just going to drop it by right now. I won't stay." Robin had her doubts about that, but there was a bigger issue at play now. "Where will you be on Sunday?" "Oh, there's a senior holiday cruise leaving from Rocky Ridge on Saturday morning." She gave a light laugh. "I bought myself a ticket on a whim." Robin had fallen still, her mind trying to work through what her mother had said. "Senior holiday cruise?" "Yes, for men and women above age 65, her mother said, her voice full of forced importance. "It's going to Nantucket for a few days, then over to the Hamptons, then down to New York City." "You'll be gone for Christmas?" "It's a 14-day cruise," her mother said. "So yes, I won't be back until the 27th. "Wow." Robin exhaled, not quite sure what to think. I can't believe I'm just hearing about this now. I just decided today, her mom said. I'll be by in about 10 minutes. Okay. Robin turned as the timer on the oven went off. Bye, Mom. She set her phone on the counter and reached for the oven mitts. The cake was done, and she slid it onto the stovetop just as the front door opened and Jamie's and Mandy's voices filled the air. Is all I mean, Mandy said. You have to be careful with girls like that, Jamesy. Don't call me that, Jamie said. I'm not a baby. Robin held very still once more, listening to her daughters. I'm just saying, Mandy said, her voice purposefully quiet. She's not a nice person, and she's probably using you. Whatever, Jamie said, and her footsteps went down the hall that led to the bedrooms in the house. Mandy came around the corner and met Robin's eye. Robin's eyebrows lifted of their own accord. What's going on? Oh, there's this mean girl who's befriended Jamie. Mandy sighed as she put her backpack on the built-in desk and joined Robin in the kitchen. She opened a drawer and tied an apron around her neck and waist. I tried to tell her to be careful. Sarah Elizabeth is not anyone's friend. How do you know? Robin got out of the kitchen as Mandy started pulling together the rest of the frosting ingredients. Jamie was in 8th grade at the junior high, and Mandy had just started her junior year at the high school. Everyone knows about those Phillips girls, Mandy said. The queen bee at the high school is Carrie. She's the exact same way. She shrugged. I just steer clear of her, but I've heard stories. Apparently Sarah Elizabeth is twice as snobby and twice as cruel. Robin looked toward the hallway, hoping Jamie would reappear and they could talk. Her mama bear instincts wanted to keep Jamie safe from mean girls and boys and bad grades and anything disappointing at all. In reality, she knew she couldn't do that. She didn't even want to do that. People learned a lot from the disappointing things in their lives, and she didn't want to rob her girls of those learning experiences. She just wanted them to have the softest consequences possible. Should I talk to her? No, Mandy said. I'll keep my eye on her. She put the cake in the fridge before she whipped up the frosting. I'll get her to come help decorate. Oh, right. Robin jumped from the stool and went down the hall to her office. She took the huge bouquet of balloons she'd picked up that morning into the kitchen and returned to the office to get the streamers and tape. Jamie had come into the kitchen, and the three of them worked together to turn the common area at the back of the house into Party Central. Mandy didn't say anything about Sarah Elizabeth, and Robin followed her lead. The time passed quickly, and Mandy had just finished the peaks and the cake frosting when the garage door opened. He's here, Robin said, her heart beating faster now. Come over here. The girls hurried to her side, and the moment Duke appeared at the end of the hall, they started singing. He lifted his head, a smile spreading across his whole face. Robin could still tell something was wrong. Terribly wrong. She kept singing, though, and when they finished, Duke clapped for them and stepped into all three of them to hug them. Ah, my girls, he said, his voice not nearly as jovial as usual. Thank you. What a great surprise. Robin wasn't sure how he could be surprised, unless he'd forgotten it was his birthday. She made sure he had cake and dinner and decorations every year. Presents first, Jamie said, her normal, smiling self. She handed them out, and Duke gave the proper performance for each one, even kissing Robin after he opened the walkie-talkies. Okay, let's eat, she said. We can have cake now or later, doesn't matter to me. She met Duke's eye, and he'd sobered again already. He was usually so fun-loving, with bad jokes about the ocean and the types of fish it held, loud laughter, and serious but not serious questions about Charlie, Mandy's boyfriend. Tonight, there was none of that. Robin pulled 4 plates from the cupboard and set them next to the slow cooker. It's your favorite, baby, she said. Barbecue meatball subs. Thanks, babe. His smile lit the house, and he perked up after that. The girls talked about school, and Robin spoke up about her weddings, and Duke said he saw a couple of whales that day. Dinner ended quickly, and Mandy put the candles in the cake for her father. They sang Happy Birthday for a second time, and Duke actually paused, closed his eyes, and waited a moment before blowing out the candles. Had he actually made a wish? And if so, what for? Mandy served the cake, and Robin got out the vanilla ice cream. They spent the evening together, and finally, the girls went down the hall to finish their homework and go to bed. "Come on, Mr. Grover," Robin said, smiling at her husband. She stood and extended her hand to him. "It's time to put you to bed, too." Duke smiled at her, put his hand in hers, and let her lead him down the hall to their master's suite. She hadn't cleaned up the dishes after dinner, something she always did. Tonight, though, she didn't care. With the door locked, she turned toward her handsome husband. "What's wrong?" Duke hung his head. "I didn't want to say anything during the party." "You're not great at hiding how you feel," she said. "I knew something was wrong the moment you came into the house." Duke nodded and started unbuttoning his jeans. "The boat got damaged in the storm today." Robin paused in the middle of changing into her pajamas. "How bad is it?" His boat had been damaged before, and he'd come home with a positive attitude. He'd been working on a fishing boat for decades, and the man could fix almost anything. "I couldn't stay to see how bad," he said. "It was dark already, and we barely made it back to the dock." Barely made it back? That didn't sound good at all. "Brian said he'd help me tomorrow if he can't go out. The weather is supposed to be wicked for the next couple of days." He stripped his shirt off and, wearing only his boxer shorts, went into the bathroom. Robin slipped into her silk pajamas and sat up in bed, waiting for him to return. He did only a few minutes later, and he looked a decade older instead of just 1 year. He ran one hand down his face and crawled into bed with her. He laid his head in her lap, and Robin liked the way such a simple gesture made her feel powerful and strong. She stroked his hair, wondering if he wanted to be intimate that night. He sure seemed to be in a bad place, and perhaps he was too tired, though it was his birthday, and he'd always told her she was the best and only present he needed each year. Duke rarely worried, and that made Robin's concern double. She was the one who obsessed over every little thing. It made her a great wedding and event planner, but brought a lot of stress into other aspects of her life. "Duke?" she finally asked. "How bad is it?" "Bad, babe," he said. "Like, so bad we need a new boat? So bad we can't afford to fix it?" "I won't know until tomorrow." He lifted his head and looked at her with those dark, deep, delicious eyes she'd fallen in love with the very moment she'd seen them. "We need a Christmas miracle, then," Robin said, thinking she better start praying for exactly that. "I just need you," he whispered, lifting himself up so he could kiss her. Robin felt his usual passion for her in his touch, and as they made love, she tried to be as present as possible. But really, the worry about how they'd pay for a new boat if the damage was really that bad lingered in the back of her mind. Please, please, she thought as she lay in her husband's embrace. The one thing she'd feared Garrett Hall would do seemed to be coming true, and Robin told herself that even Garrett, though he'd seemed all-powerful last fall, couldn't influence the weather in the Atlantic. She simply needed a Christmas miracle, and she pressed her eyes closed, inhaled the scent of her husband's skin, and prayed for that miracle. Chapter 3. "Grab that other garbage bag, bud," Kelly Thompson said to her son. Parker did so without complaint, which meant a lot to her. He was normally a pretty agreeable child, but there had been so many changes in his life lately, and Kelly had seen him getting upset at seemingly simple things. She knew everyone dealt with trauma in different ways, and having his father come to the Cove with a pledge to make things work, only to have him leave 10 weeks later, had definitely been hard on Parker. Kelly could admit that she was still having a hard time letting go of her marriage to Julian. She had no problem hauling out 3 bags of trash and tossing them in the can she'd gotten just this month. Once Julian had finally admitted that he wasn't happy in Five Island Cove, and that his quick trip to Jersey to oversee a few things for his courier business would be a permanent relocation for him, Kelly had decided she needed to do something to move forward. Living in limbo simply wasn't fun. And while she did like the cottage on the beach, and it was more than sufficient for just her and Parker, she owned a home on Belle Island which didn't require a mortgage payment. As she lifted the lid on the garbage can and hefted her bags inside it, Kelly's lungs burned with the chill in the air. The weather had turned in the past couple of days, and Kelly felt a shift in her life as well. She'd brought Parker to visit her mother, spent a great day with her and her boyfriend, Devin, and then they'd ended up at the house on Seabreeze Shore. She'd told him that she'd grown up in the house with her two sisters, and then she'd said, "I own it, Parker. It needs some work, but if we fix it up, we can live here." She'd looked at him, the light of the day quickly fading, and Parker had simply stared up at the house with the pillars on the front porch, the crooked shutters, and the faded front door. Everything about the house needed to be spruced up, but Kelly had watched Eloise dig into a house 4 times this big and at least 5 times as messy. She'd cleaned up the Cliffside Inn, and that had inspired Kelly in ways she couldn't name. "I got it," Kelly said, throwing out her hand to help Parker as he tried to lift his garbage bag into the trash can. "We got so much done today." She dropped the bag in the can and let the lid bang closed. "Should we stop by Kaleidoscope and get one of those chocolate cakes?" "Yes," Parker said with a smile. He looked like the little boy her whole world revolved around in that moment, and she drew him into a hug. "Thanks for working hard today," she whispered into his hair. It used to be the same color as hers, and she'd waited so long to get this boy in her life. She thought God had blessed her with the most beautiful child on the planet. Now, Parker's hair was darkening into a tone very much like his father's, but Kelly would love him until her dying day. "I think if we come a couple of times each week and work hard," she said, "we can move in once the weather turns warm again." A springtime goal of moving from the beach house on Sanctuary Island to this one on Belle felt fast to her, but Kelly needed to do things without thinking about them until she knew the precise solution, all of the steps, and exactly how the outcome would look. Life was simply too messy for that. And the worst part was, Kelly hadn't even known it until Julian had called to say he just couldn't come back to the Cove. Her life had not been perfect up until that point, but once she'd left Five Island Cove behind her, it had been simple. She'd found a great guy, and she'd fallen in love. It had taken a while for her to get pregnant, but she just readjusted her plans and made new ones. That was all she had to do now, too. The difference was, she wasn't going to take a year to decide. She had a job at the junior high on Diamond Island, and she and Parker rode the ferry together each morning. He sat in the teacher's office until he had to walk the half-mile to the elementary school, and she finished before him, so she was always waiting in a rideshare when his final bell rang. Lately, Duke Grover had been waiting out front at the junior high to drive Parker to the elementary school, as he brought his youngest to school and didn't mind waiting for Parker. He didn't get out on the boat as much in the winter, and he apparently had time. Kelly was grateful for every person who came into her life and offered her some assistance. Even just a friendly text meant the world to her. "We're not coming next week, though, right?" Parker asked, and Kelly finally led him back toward the garage. "No," she said. "We'll be at the inn next weekend." She smiled at her son. "Grandma and Devin are coming, too. It's going to be a big party." "Charlie and Jamie will be there, too," Parker said, and Kelly smiled at the way he worshipped the older kids. "Yep." Kelly went up the steps and into the house. They'd spent the morning on the first floor, filling garbage bags with anything in the house that she didn't want there anymore. Old things that had been left in the house, or trash that had blown in somehow. She took a deep breath and continued through the kitchen and into the living room. 3/4 of the house was one big open area on this floor, and the kitchen flowed into the living room, which melded into a den or office of sorts. In the back corner sat the master suite, and while the bathroom and closet weren't anything to write home about, Kelly adored every corner of this house. The popcorn nook under the steps still held the beanbags she and AJ had lounged in last time they'd come to the house together, and she'd only managed to mop one room while Parker dusted all the blinds and windowsills. The house sat empty, without much furniture in it, just the beanbags under the steps and a rickety dining room table in the kitchen. Kelly sighed as she looked around and saw how much she needed to be able to live here. All of it cost money, something Kelly didn't have a lot of. Worry and doubt started to gnaw at her hopes of moving into the house in only 3 or 4 months, but she straightened her shoulders. She wasn't going to let anything slow her down or stop her. Not this time. When she got home, she'd go over her budget again, and she'd see if she could squeeze out a few more dollars. The island always had estate sales and yard sales in the spring and early summer, and perhaps she could find some decent furniture at a reduced price. Satisfied with that idea of a plan, she walked over to the railing, where she and Parker had draped their coats. "Here you go, bud." She handed Parker's dark blue coat to him, and then she shrugged into her red one. "Mom?" Parker asked as they left the house. They could get a rideshare to the ferry station, but it was only a 10-minute walk, and it would take that long just to get a car to her house. This was definitely one way she could save a few dollars. "Yeah, baby." She reached over and tugged his beanie over his ear. "Is Dad coming for Christmas?" Kelly's lungs seized. "I don't think so." Julian hadn't said anything about the holidays. He hadn't asked to see Parker for Thanksgiving, which was a couple of weeks ago, and Kelly hadn't spoken to him about custody at all. She had called the state of New Jersey to find out how to get divorced, and she had a green file folder in a drawer in her kitchen at the beach house. If she filed, it would cost $300. She'd have to take a parenting class, which also cost money, and she'd have to be the one to appear in court. Julian could skip the hearing if he wanted to, and he wouldn't have to pay a dime. He also hadn't been sending her any money since she and Parker had come to the Cove in the middle of August, and they'd lived here for about a month before he came with the claims that he wanted to try again. He'd left 5 weeks ago now, and Kelly's pulse felt heavy in her chest and loud in her ears. He hadn't removed her from their joint checking account either, so she supposed he was still willing to help her with things. Kelly hated logging onto their bank account, though, because then she saw transactions at the gourmet cheese shop she'd told Julian about that he'd never wanted to visit because everything was too expensive. She saw money flying out of the account with nail salon names attached to it. She saw utility bills getting paid doubly for different amounts. All of it told her that Tiffany was back in his life, and that he was paying for a large portion of her life. Her throat narrowed as the wind picked up, and Kelly turned her face fully into the salty, stiff air. So many things gave way to the wind, but she would not. She was going to see her way through this, no matter what. The ferry station came into view, and she and Parker hurried inside as the return ferry was already at the dock. They had monthly passes they scanned, and they were 2 of the last people onto the ferry. They'd barely had time to find a spot inside the enclosed section of the ferry before it pulled away from the dock, and Kelly pressed her eyes closed, trying to quiet her pulse and her thoughts. She hadn't told her mother about the house where she and Parker had been working for the past 2 weekends. She hadn't told Alice, Eloise, Robin, or Kristen. For a long time, Kelly wasn't sure she could ever live in the house again, though she certainly didn't want anyone else to live there. "You're ready now," she told herself. Being there these past few weeks had been very therapeutic, and Kelly felt herself taking a big step forward. A smile touched her lips, and Kelly just let her body sway with the movement of the boat, maybe liking the sea for the first time in her life. "Ma'am?" a man said, and Kelly's eyes flew open. She blinked a couple of times before she could truly see the person standing there. "Sorry," she said. The man smiled, and he looked really familiar to Kelly. A lot of people in 5 Island Cove did, and 8 months ago she hadn't wanted to run into anyone she knew. Now, though, she could handle meeting someone she'd known as a teenager. "It's fine." He narrowed his eyes at her. "Do I know you?" "I grew up here," she said. "If you did too, it's likely." He touched his jacket, where the name tag read Billy. "I'm William Bridge." "Billy Bridge," she said, her smile widening. "Kelly Watkins." She put her arm around Parker. Well, Thompson now. At least for a little while longer. She needed to talk to Julian about him filing for divorce. If he could pay for his mistress to get a manicure and a pedicure, he could foot the cost to file for divorce. He was the one choosing another woman over his current wife and son. "So good to see you." Billy gave her a quick handshake. "You hung around with A.J. Proctor, right?" Of course he'd be interested in A.J. Men always were, and that was absolutely nothing new. "That's right," she said, "and Eloise Hall, Robin Golden, and Alice Williams. You surely remember Robin." "I remember," he said, still grinning. "I knew Alice the best. We rode the ferry over from Rocky Ridge together for a while before I moved to Diamond." "Oh, right," Kelly said, though she hadn't known that. Alice had rarely spoken of her home life out on Rocky Ridge, and she was almost two different people in Kelly's head. "Anyway," Billy said, "we're doing a survey on the ferry system." He handed her a small, square card. "You just scan that with your phone and answer the questions. It'll take less than 5 minutes, and anyone who does it is entered to win a free monthly pass." He gave her a professional smile, and Kelly returned it. She took the card, and he moved over to the next patron. Kelly scanned the card, listening to him give the same spiel to a couple down the row. On his way by again, he paused as he was almost past Kelly. "You don't happen to have Alice's number, do you?" he asked. Kelly looked up from her phone, surprise darting through her. "I do," she said slowly. "Let me give you mine," he said. "If you talk to her, and it's okay that I have her number, maybe you could pass my number to her. She can text me herself." He cleared his throat. "If she wants to." Kelly twisted more fully toward him, trying to read his expression. Those dark blue eyes simply held a hint of hope, and Kelly wondered just how good of friends he and Alice had been 3 decades ago. He wore his sandy hair a little bit long, and Alice would probably like that after her polished and buttoned-up lawyer husband. Billy's hair curled along the ends, and he sported a little bit of stubble on his face, too. He'd aged, just like the rest of them, but he was still tall, tan, and trim, and Kelly had no doubt he could get a date any time he wanted. "All right," she said, tapping away from his survey to a fresh note. "I'm ready." "It's Will now," he said as she tapped out the wrong name. "I left behind Billy when we graduated." "Okay." Kelly erased what she'd typed and put in Will Bridge. "Go." He recited the number, and she tapped it in. She turned her phone toward him so he could double-check it, and after he'd nodded and continued on with his survey cards, Kelly stared at the number. All thoughts of the survey gone now, though she could use the free ferry pass. Kelly quickly tapped and held to copy everything she'd just typed into her phone. She couldn't get a text off to Alice fast enough.
Chapter 4. Alice Williams said thank you in a calm voice as she finished up her transaction with the rideshare driver. She opened the back door and stepped out of the car, only to have her breath stolen by the freezing temperature of the air. Her phone buzzed, but she ignored it. She was late for her weekly lunch with Robin, Kristen, and Eloise, and it was likely one of them. While she and Eloise had planned to meet up on the ferry, Alice had been late leaving home, and now she was 20 minutes behind schedule. Inside one of the only chain restaurants that had come to the Cove, Alice finally took a breath deeper than a gasp and pulled out her phone. There was a line of people just to check in with the hostess, and if her friends were already here, she wouldn't have to wait. Robin had texted 10 minutes ago to say they'd gone back to a table without her, and she quickly sent a reply to let her friends know she'd arrived. The most recent text had come from Will Bridge, and Alice's smile came instantly. She'd been texting with him for a few days now, and she hadn't told anyone yet. She held her head high, though, because she had to have something to say during today's Good News Minute, something she and her friends had implemented into their lunches in the past few months. Eloise almost always said something about the progress of her inn. If it wasn't that, she spoke of Aaron and their upcoming wedding. She and Robin tried very hard not to discuss the wedding much at lunch, as it left the others out, and Robin didn't want to work at their midweek lunches. Robin often spoke of her family or Duke's fishing, and Kristen's news was almost always something about Reuben, Kelly, or AJ. Alice loved them all fiercely. So when Robin said, "Alice," she lifted her eyes from Will's text,
"What's your favorite meal these days? Like last meal type of stuff."
and moved effortlessly through the crowd. She'd gained 15 pounds since the most stressful summer of her life, and Alice was very happy where she was right now. She didn't feel like only bone and skin, and no one looked at her like she was one breath away from collapsing. "Hey!" She reached Robin and hugged her. "Sorry I'm late." She sighed like someone else was to blame for her tardiness, but she really only had herself to pin the problem to. "I set a timer, but I just couldn't stop in the middle of what I was doing."
"The Tacoma estate?"
"Yes," she said. Alice didn't speak of her cases often, or at all, but the ones where the most unusual things happened sometimes got a mention. The Tacoma estate had been in probate for over 3 years, and the siblings were still fighting as if their father had died yesterday. Alice had met with each of the 4 siblings twice now, and she was the third lawyer they'd hired to try to sort out the mess their dad had left behind. If Thomas Tacoma hadn't been loaded, with 3 separate homes scattered up and down the East Coast, the fact that he hadn't prepared his estate or final will and testament wouldn't have mattered at all. He'd died here in the Cove, and 2 of his children still lived here. They'd been using the big city lawyers until her, and Alice was determined to prove that she could do a better job than anyone in any city. Kristen and Eloise grinned at each other as Alice and Robin approached, and Alice took the only seat where nothing had been disturbed. She deftly spread her napkin across her lap as Eloise and Kristen finished their conversation, and sudden gladness moved through Alice that she hadn't canceled today. She probably should have, as she'd signed another client on Monday, and she needed to get through the initial paperwork by next Monday. That was her policy. She'd review all documents the client brought her within 7 days. Alice reminded herself she had plenty of time, as the estate and this new client were the only 2 cases she had at the moment. When she thought like that, her heart skipped a beat, reminding her that she had bills to pay, groceries to buy, and children to provide for. She drew in a deep breath and pushed it out, something the trio of other women at the table all saw. "What's wrong?" Robin asked. "Nothing," Alice said. They all knew about Frank. They all knew that he wasn't sending money anymore. "I have 2 things for Good News Minute." She smiled at Robin to get the worry to leave her best friend's eyes. "Should I go first?" Robin looked down at her drink and said,
"I don't have anything this week, so you can have my spot." "Nothing?"
Kristen asked.
"It was Duke's birthday recently, wasn't it? What's so great about being 1 year older?"
Robin asked, and that so wasn't like her. She looked at Kristen with an edge in her eyes that said, "How dare you try to make me feel better?" And Alice wondered what had happened in the past week. She spoke to all of her friends regularly, and no one more than Robin. She'd said nothing about anything, and her foul mood came at Alice out of left field.
"Sorry,"
Kristen said. At the same time, Robin said the word too. "I'm just stressed," Robin continued. "Duke's boat is not repairable." She reached up and swiped at her eyes, and that sent tremors through Alice. It took something huge and heavy to bring tears to Robin's eyes. "My mother's off on some singles cruise and won't be here for Christmas, and someone called me this morning to put together a wedding for a December 28th date. Apparently their planner bailed on them, and they heard I was good." "You are good," Eloise said quietly. "The 28th is in 11 days," Robin said. "No one is that good."
"What do you always say?"
Kristen asked, glancing at Alice.
"Find a venue. Everything else after that is just gravy." "I think she says icing,"
Eloise said, her dark eyes glinting with joy. "Chocolate icing," Alice said, piling her voice onto those trying to help Robin feel better. She looked around at all of them, and it was clear she was trying to stay mad. In the end, she broke. Her shoulders slumped, and Alice reached over to put her arm around her. "I'll take the wedding," Robin said, "but I'm going to have to work at the inn." She looked hopefully at Eloise, as if Elle would tell her to forget about booking a wedding if she actually had to work to plan it.
"There's downtime,"
Eloise said.
"That's the whole point of the inn. You don't like the pressure of the holidays with your mother anyway,"
Kristen said, and Alice wished she'd jumped in with that reassurance. "True," Robin mused. Kristen and Eloise looked at Alice as if she would have a perfect solution for the fishing boat that Duke needed to support his family. Alice had no idea what to say, and she silently begged her friends for help. No one said anything, and Alice finally opened her mouth. "I'm sure you and Duke will figure out what to do about his boat. He really can't fix it?" Robin had texted last week to say Duke's boat had been damaged on his birthday when the storm that had officially brought winter weather to the cove had blown across the islands. She'd asked for their prayers and good thoughts, and Alice had given them both to Robin and Duke. Charlie was still dating Robin's daughter, and Alice didn't stop worrying about her son for a single moment. The two teens seemed to get along really well, and with Mandy as mature as she was, she helped to keep Charlie's hormones in check. Alice reminded herself that her son was a good boy too, and that he wasn't his father. It was Alice's entire goal to get him to adulthood with a new vision for how he could live his life that didn't involve taking advantage of women.
"My good news is that the Cliffside Inn is completely full from Christmas Eve to January 16th.
Eloise said, her face one glowing ray of light. "Eloise," Alice said, her smile forming quickly. "That's so great." She reached across the table and squeezed her friend's hand. "You're ready,"
I hope.
Eloise said.
You guys will help me with that this Saturday. Check-in starts at 3.
She drew a deep breath and looked at Kristen.
I've texted all of you the times I want you to come, so I can see how it goes when we have a rush and when people are coming in late.
Alice nodded and flipped her phone over when another text from Will came in. "Robin and I will be there at our appointed time."
"Oh, that's right,"
Eloise said.
"You're moving on Saturday."
"Well, kind of," Alice said. "We're moving a lot of stuff so we can enjoy our time at the inn, and then our last Christmas in the big house." Alice refused to let her emotions get the best of her. She did love the house on Rocky Ridge, but when she'd first bought it, it was a status symbol. It had been a safe haven for her and the children for the past 6 months, but Alice wanted to keep a roof over her head, and it didn't need to cover 8,000 square feet. She'd found a house here on Diamond Island, which would be easier for the twins to get to school. She'd also get more clients by being more centrally located, and Alice was actually excited for yet another change in her life. "That's actually part of my news," she said. "I got an offer on the house on Monday, and I accepted it." A moment of silence pressed down on the table, and then all three of them broke into various exclamations of congratulations. Alice grinned at them, basking in their love and friendship, and she did let her emotions shake her chin then. A waitress appeared, and Alice glanced up and said, "I'd love a raspberry gin and tonic," she said. "What in the world?" Robin asked, waving away a refill on her soda. Eloise had likewise quieted, and only Kristen continued to look around.
"I'm missing something." "Alice doesn't drink," Robin said, "unless she has something huge to celebrate." "She just got an offer on her house," Kristen said. "That's huge, right? It's been on the market for 6 weeks." "It's huge," Robin said, "but not drinking huge." She hadn't taken her eyes from Alice for a single second. "Alice, you better start talking." Alice reached for her water glass, her fingers shaking slightly. She loved holding a secret, a good one at least, over Robin's head. "Kristen, do you have anything for Good News Minute?" "I guess I better say my thing before you tell us why you're drinking today." "Ooh, sometimes drinking is bad," Eloise said. "It's not bad, is it, Alice?" "It's Good News Minute, Elle."
Robin said, finally moving her gaze to someone besides Alice.
Sometimes good news is actually something bad happening,
Eloise said.
like my divorce.
And Kelly's, Alice said.
Did she file?
Alice shook her head as she took a sip of her water. No, but she said she was getting ready to do it. I worry about her, Robin said with a sigh, though I suppose she can't simply stay married to him. I just don't want her to have to go through anything hard. Alice had only met Julian once, when he'd come to the cove at the end of the summer. He'd seemed distracted and overwhelmed, but he did seem to want to make things work with his wife, at least for a few weeks. If there was anything Alice had learned in the past 9 months, it was that she couldn't do it all. While it seemed like Julian could move here, keep his wife and son, and run his business in New Jersey, Alice knew there were limits to a person's energy, time, and patience. She knew because she'd never expected to be where she was, sitting at a table with her friends from her childhood, having lost everything that had been ultra-important only a few months ago. The house in the Hamptons, gone. The vacation home overlooking the beach, sold. The PTA presidency, given up. All she had were her twins and her friends, and Alice had learned she didn't need anything more than that.
My good news is that Jean and I have started sewing together in the afternoons,
Kristen said, her voice as quiet as her smile.
She's getting more comfortable here, and I'm so enjoying getting to know her.
That's great, Alice said genuinely. Kristen's daughter-in-law had really struggled to come to the cove and make her life as a lighthouse keeper's wife, something Alice understood on a fundamental level. Yes, Robin said. I'm so glad, Kristen. I wish I liked to sew. I'd come over.
Like you have time to sew,
Eloise said.
My mother tried to teach me, and I just can't seem to get the thread to obey me. Oh, I should invite your mother,
Kristen said.
Do you think she'd like that? I honestly don't know,
Eloise said.
It's not like she's sewing for enjoyment, but she might come once a week or something.
A bit of anxiety had come into Eloise's dark eyes, though, and Alice shot a look in Kristen's direction. Robin had obviously picked up on Eloise's nerves, too, because she said, You don't want to invite someone else anyway. It's your special time with Jean. Kristen nodded, and the message had gotten through.
All right, Alice, go ahead.
Alice's fingers automatically inched toward her phone. The reason I'm celebrating with a drink today is because... She cut off as the waitress set her perfectly pink drink on the table in front of her. Look how pretty it is. She smiled at the drink, her mouth watering already. She told herself to take 3 sips and be done. She hadn't had alcohol for a long time, and even a few sips could make her tipsy despite her increased weight. Alice, I swear, if you don't start talking, Robin warned. Alice picked up her phone and swiped it on. Will had texted her a couple more times, and Alice scanned them quickly.
I like to cook after riding the ferry all day. If you'd like, I'd love to cook for you sometime, or we can go to dinner, whichever you prefer.
Alice grinned at the words, but she didn't take the time to answer right now. Not with Robin's glare boring holes in the side of her face. Instead, Alice handed the phone to her and said, Will Bridge and I have been chatting, and he just asked me out.
Will Bridge?
Eloise asked, her eyebrows bunched down.
Who is that?
Billy Bridge, Robin said, the words almost a hiss. She looked up from the phone. You're going to go out with Billy Bridge? Her blue eyes looked like dinner plates, and Alice sure did enjoy that. She lifted her drink to her lips and took a sip. Oh, she liked that too. The tang of the raspberries made her smile, and the alcohol warmed her from the inside out. Yes, she said with a giggle. I looked him up online, and he is very good-looking.
Billy Bridge?
Eloise said.
How do you know him? He grew up on the ridge too, right?
Yes, Alice said, exchanging a glance with Robin. Her dinner plates turned hopeful, and Alice gave her a nod. She squealed and faced Kristen and Eloise.
Alice used to sneak out of our cabin in summer camp and go over to the boys' side to see one Billy Bridge.
He goes by Will now, Alice said. Can I have my phone back so I can confirm that I'd love to go to dinner with him? Robin handed her the phone while Eloise started to ask more questions. Alice took another sip of her drink and started tapping out a reply.
Chapter 5. Kristen Shields walked beneath the foaming, nearly black sky, her luggage bumping over the rough sidewalk behind her. If she didn't get on the ferry in the next half hour, she didn't think she'd make it to Sanctuary Island. A half an hour remained before she needed to leave to arrive at her assigned check-in time at the Cliffside Inn, but Mother Nature had a way of disrupting the most well-laid plans. Kristen quickly put her luggage in the back of her car and turned back to the lighthouse. Though the afternoon still had hours of light left in it, Reuben had already turned on the beam. Worry hit her as she moved as quickly as she dared toward the navy blue door on the back of the lighthouse. The rain hadn't started to fall yet, but it was imminent. Kristen had lived for decades in the cove, and she could feel the weather down in her bones. She knocked on the door and twisted the knob as a gust of wind kicked up off the water. The crashing of waves against the rocks on the other side of the lighthouse could be plainly heard, and she needed to send a text to all of her girls, too. No one should be traveling this afternoon or evening. "Reuben," she said, barely able to push the door closed behind her. She managed it, the windows above her in the stairwell rattling with the force of the wind outside, angry as it was that anything dared to defy it. She went up instead of down, because if Reuben was doing his job, he'd be up in the office on the upper level of the lighthouse. It was 3 flights of uneven stairs, and Kristen took them one step at a time. "Reuben," she said when she reached the top landing. She glanced out the huge windows that overlooked the ocean beyond, and all she could see was a wall of blackness coming toward the cove. She suddenly wished she'd brought her bag into the lighthouse instead of putting it in her back seat. "Mother?" Reuben appeared in the doorway, concern in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" "I was just getting ready to go to the Cliffside Inn," she said. "I saw the storm." "You shouldn't go," he said, turning back and gesturing to her at the same time. "Come look at the radar." He retreated into the office, and Kristen hurried after him. All of the screens shone in the small space, and she'd read them for years alongside her husband. She knew what they showed before her son said a word. "There's a huge storm in the Atlantic," he said. "It's finally been named a hurricane as of 9 o'clock this morning, but it's just sitting out there." "Obviously not," Kristen said as the wind attacked the front windows again. "There is something else," Reuben said. "I've never seen anything like it." He indicated the middle monitor. "Look at that. It's like there's just nothing. There's just nothing. I can't see the meteorology. I don't see any of the wind or rain or anything." Kristen sucked in a breath. "Reuben, it's like it's just open water, but I feel like I could see something there a few minutes ago." "Check the Richter scale readings," she said, her pulse pounding. "I'm calling the mayor." "The Richter scale readings?" Reuben tore his eyes from the screen. "The mayor?" "That's a tsunami," Kristen said, "and it's coming this way." She put the call on speaker so she could text her seafaring girls. "Tsunami coming toward the cove. Get somewhere high and safe right now. I'm at the lighthouse with Reuben and Jean. Please check in so I know you're safe." She'd likely lose cell phone service when the wall of water slammed into the east coast of the cove, but Kristen couldn't control everything. She couldn't control anything, as Joel's death had taught her. "Kristen?" Connie Adams asked. "To what do I owe this honor?" "There's a tsunami coming toward the cove," she said, bending down to peer at the screen. "It's moving fairly slowly, definitely not as fast as the only other one I've seen, and Reuben is checking the Richter scale readings right now." "There was a 7.5 magnitude earthquake right about halfway between here and Europe a little over 2 hours ago," Reuben said, and Connie started barking orders at someone in her office. "When is it going to hit us?" Connie asked, adding, "Yes, get the National Geological Survey on the line to confirm this. Send out the emergency texts." Kristen met Reuben's eyes. "We'll sound the siren," Kristen said, and Reuben's eyes widened. He straightened, his shoulders pulling back as he drew in a deep breath. He left, and he'd have to go down a level to start the siren. He was big, fast, and strong, and Kristen was so glad she wasn't running this place anymore. "Yes, the calls too," Connie said. "Everything. Kristen," she said, her voice louder, "how long do we have?" "If it's been moving for 2 hours," Kristen said. "I don't know, Connie." The first whine of the siren started, and it would grow to an ear-splitting volume in a matter of seconds, making conversation nearly impossible. Kristen studied the screen. "I think it'll be here by nightfall." Some of the most powerful tsunamis in the world could cross whole oceans in a day, but this one clearly wasn't moving as fast as ones generated by stronger earthquakes. "It probably has to travel 2,000 miles, Kristen said, crossing to the door and closing it to buy herself a few more seconds. "Even at 200 or 300 miles per hour, it might be halfway here." "So 2 or 3 more hours?" "Probably," Kristen said, "and it's going to run straight into the hurricane brewing out there. Reuben said they just named it this morning." "Get somewhere safe," Connie said. "Thank you, Kristen." "You get somewhere safe, too," Kristen said, and the call ended. Her phone lit up with text notifications, several of them from her girls.
"How long?"
Alice had asked. "The Cliffside Inn is open for anyone," Eloise said. "It's one of the highest places on the cove. If you can get here, Kristen, get here."
"We're heading to the ferry now,"
Robin said. "Parker and I are on the ferry from Belle," Kelly said. "Arrival on Sanctuary in 37 minutes. Do we have time, Kristen?" "Matt and I are already at the inn," AJ said. "What can we do to help the rest of you get here?" "I called Aaron," Eloise said. "He's on his way here too, and he's going to get my mother. Kelly, he's probably going to arrive at the same time as you. He'll look for you before he leaves." Kristen read through the texts as quickly as she could, glad she could warn those she loved. She sent a text to her church knitting group, though the siren was going strong now. It was so loud it could be heard on all 5 islands in the cove. And the next text that came in was from the city of Five Island Cove. "A confirmed 7.7 magnitude earthquake struck at 12:24 p.m. this afternoon, about 2,100 miles from Five Island Cove. A tsunami has spread in all directions, and the wall of water is currently making its way toward the cove. All flights have been grounded, and no flights will be outgoing." Her phone rang, and Kristen swiped on the local area code number. A recording of the text message she'd been reading started. She let it run so it would register, otherwise their system would call her again. "The ferry system will close immediately. No more ferries will be leaving any of the stations around the cove, and any ferries in transit will dock at the nearest station. All hotels are open for anyone who needs them, and anyone who can should get to the highest location possible. Anyone on the outer islands should not attempt to come to Diamond, though the majority of the hotels are here. There are several options on all of the islands with upper-level floors, and we urge all businesses to open their doors to anyone in need. For more information, visit the Five Island Cove website, where all information will be updated in real time." Reuben bustled back into the room and sat in front of the middle screen. "I've never seen a tsunami on the radar. I didn't know. I saw this 40 minutes ago." He scoffed and shook his head. "I feel like an idiot." "I've only seen it once," she said. "You have nothing to feel bad about. There's time." "How much time?" he asked. "At least 3 hours," Kristen said. "Mark where the earthquake was, and then where the tsunami is now, and chart it." Reuben began doing that, and Kristen went back to her texts. Her girls kept messaging, and she hated that almost all of them were currently on ferries on the water. At the same time, she wanted to rush to the ferry station and get on the next one headed to Sanctuary. The Cliffside Inn would be 10 times safer than this lighthouse on the edge of the ocean. Yes, it sat up on a cliff, but it was the first thing the waves would hit. "It doesn't matter," she thought. The waves are going to cover the entire island. They might not be big enough to reach the upper cliffs on Sanctuary where Eloise's inn sat, and Kristen closed her eyes and thanked the Lord that all of her girls would be there soon. It's moving at 257 miles per hour, Reuben said. It's only a third of the way here. He spun in his chair. We have about 6 hours before it'll be here. I'll text Connie that we've done more precise calculations, Kristen said. But the professionals at the NGS will have figured it out by now. She sent the text anyway, because she wanted the mayor to know they were still there and still working on the problem. Kristen almost wished the tsunami would hit sooner. In 6 hours, it would be after 9:30, with a night as dark as pitch. Chapter 6. Laurel Baker blew her whistle and gestured at the blue sedan. It was times like these that she'd rather be anything but a police officer. Technically, she was a detective, but in an island crisis, it was all hands on deck. The last ferry had arrived on Sanctuary 20 minutes ago, and almost all of the cars were off the streets now. When the first texts had come in from Chief Sherman and then the government about the tsunami, Laurel's first thought was to get home and make sure she had everything essential. Her birth certificate and passport, the photo albums with her grandmother's pictures. She needed to board her windows and doors. She needed to make sure her younger sister got somewhere safe. She'd called Jenny, and she was headed to her boyfriend's house on the southwest side of Diamond. With any luck, they wouldn't be washed away. Laurel hadn't had time to check on the tsunami's progress in the past 40 minutes since the warnings had gone out. She and her partner, Connor, had been assigned to clear the traffic from the streets and then get up to the Cliffside Inn, where Eloise was expecting them. She blew a bit harder on her whistle to make a white truck stop, while Connor waved someone else out of the lot. Her stomach churned, because she hadn't spoken to Eloise in months, since the night she'd accused Aaron of cheating on her with Laurel. She'd smiled at her at the station a couple of times, and Eloise had been cordial. They hadn't spent any time of any significance together, despite having a holiday party over Thanksgiving at the station they'd both attended. The last place Laurel wanted to ride out a tsunami was at the Cliffside Inn, but as her house was on Diamond Island and the ferries weren't running anymore, Laurel's choices were very limited. The last car pulled out of the parking lot, and Laurel turned toward Connor. "That's it," she called, letting her whistle fall down onto her chest. She shivered in the cold, though she wore gloves, a hat, and a heavy winter coat. She got in the passenger seat while Connor got behind the wheel, and neither of them said a word. He adjusted the heater as Laurel pulled off her gloves and hat. Her own sweat had made her hat a bit wet, and she was warmer without it on. Connor picked up the radio. "Traffic cleared at the ferry, boss," he said. "We'll do a circuit and make sure everything's closed and no one's doing anything stupid." "Don't take long," Teresa said. "The chief doesn't want anyone on staff to risk themselves. Everyone can hear the sirens and everyone got the texts. There's only so much we can do." "Roger that," Connor said as he turned down the road that led right along the coast, where the majority of shops and restaurants were on the island. They'd all closed, and the street looked like a ghost town. "It's almost eerie," Laurel said. "Have you ever been through a tsunami?" Connor asked, looking at her. "No," she said. "You?" He shook his head. "I've only been here for 12 years. There's just been the one hurricane that came this way, and it mostly blew out by the time it made it this far north. Still super windy, though." He glanced at her. "It's the wind that's the worst," she said. "Are you going to head up the cliffs now?" "Yeah," he said. "Did you get a hold of your sister?" "Yes, she's going to Corey's." She looked at him. "What about your mother?" "She's at the Cove Hyatt," Connor said. "Dad's going to the Atlantic building on Pearl. It's 12 stories, and apparently that whole top floor is full already." "Wow," she said, swallowing. "Would you mind if I called Paul?" "Of course not," he said. Laurel switched the channel on the radio and said, "Come back, Paul. It's Laurel." She released the button, hoping he was in the car, as the signal was so much better there than if he was out on the street. She waited in silence as Connor navigated the quiet streets. Finally, Paul said, "I'm here, Laurel." "Where are you?" "In the line of cars heading up the cliff," he said. "On Sanctuary. I just heard your report to the chief. You on your way up?" Relief filled her that he was headed up to safety too, and she pressed her eyes closed. "Yes," she said. "We haven't quite made it to the road going up to Cliffside Drive." "Oh, no," Connor moaned, and Laurel looked over to see what he'd noticed. The street to the left was lined with cars, both lanes with vehicles heading in the same direction. "I knew it would be packed." "Wow," Laurel said. "Paul, where are you on the road?" "Almost up," he said. "It moves faster than you think it will. We've only been on the road for about 20 minutes. "So we might make it," Laurel said as the first drops of rain splashed the windshield. At least she and Connor weren't standing out in the street directing traffic anymore. "Okay, I'll see you up there." "We're going to be okay, Laurel," Paul said, and Laurel nodded, her chest tight with worry. She'd never been in a tsunami before, and she had no idea what to expect. It was going to hit the island after dark, and she couldn't imagine being able to fall asleep tonight. She didn't want to be caught unaware when the water came gushing in through the windows. That's not going to happen, she told herself. But the truth was, no one knew what was going to happen. "I'll see you when you get here," Paul said. "Okay, Peanut?" "Okay," Laurel said. "Thanks, Paul." She switched the radio back to the public channels connected to the home base, only to hear Chief Sherman's voice calling for all units to report where they were. Connor quickly pressed the button on the radio and relayed where they were, and it certainly seemed like they were the last partnership heading in for the day. The radio went silent after that, and Laurel had a hard time keeping her fingernails out of her mouth. She always chewed her nails when she was stressed or worried, and she tucked her hands under her thighs in an attempt to control her nervous habits. Eventually, they did make their way up and up the road, but there wasn't anywhere to park at the Cliffside Inn. Thankfully, there were a few other cop cars there, one with lights flashing. "Pull in right there," she said. "There's Paul and the chief." Both men got out of the car with the lights, and Laurel had the distinct thought that they'd been waiting for her. The chief lifted one hand, and Connor brought the car to a stop. He and Laurel got out, and Aaron said, "I need to take your car back down to get Eloise's mother." "You're going to go back down?" Connor asked as Laurel's eyes sought out Paul's. Their gazes met, and she wanted to run to him and let him hold her in his strong arms. They'd been dating for 4 months now, and it was a relationship Laurel really enjoyed. He'd been very patient with her, and she'd been very honest with him. "I have to get Eloise's mother," Aaron said, "and Kelly and Parker aren't here yet. I'm going to get them all and bring them here." "I'll go with you," Connor said. "I'm going to have 3 people with me and 2 cats," Aaron said. "I'm okay. I need you guys to keep an eye on Eloise and help her out any way you can." He stepped around the open driver's door and added, "Okay?" "Okay, Chief," Connor said, stepping out of the way. Laurel migrated over to Paul's side and slipped her fingers into his. The idea of Aaron going down into danger sitting strangely in her stomach. The chief backed into the street and went back the way she and Connor had painstakingly come. Paul gently turned her, and Laurel faced the Cliffside Inn, a place she literally never thought she'd visit. She took a deep breath as a gust of wind picked up, driving the rain into her back. "Let's get inside," Paul said, and Laurel told herself she didn't have anything to worry about. She could talk to Eloise. She hadn't done anything wrong by doing the work Aaron had assigned her to do. She let Connor lead the way, and when it was time to go inside, she went last. Eloise already stood there, talking to and then hugging Connor. "Paul, thank goodness," Eloise said, taking him into a hug and holding him tight. They parted, and Laurel came face to face with Eloise. The other woman didn't even hesitate. She stepped forward and grabbed onto her. "I'm so glad you made it." "Thank you, Eloise." Laurel hugged her back, and it sure did feel nice. "How many people are here?" They stepped back, and Eloise pressed her lips together. "Maybe 50. I feel bad, but I've had to start turning people away." Laurel rubbed her hands up her arms. "Tell us how to help you. Paul's good in the kitchen, and Connor can boss people like nobody's business." She grinned at her partner, who simply shook his head without denying it. Laurel fumbled for the whistle around her neck and lifted it. "And we have whistles. Anyone steps out of line, and we'll get them back in." Eloise blinked at her and then started laughing. I could use some help in the kitchen. And Connor, if you could go over this list of room assignments to make sure I haven't made a mistake, I'd appreciate it. She handed him a clipboard. Erin says you're good at details. Sure thing, Eloise. Connor took the clipboard and studied it. Paul, Laurel, you're with me in the kitchen. I hope you're ready to deal with my friend Alice, though. She knows nothing about cooking, but I can't get her to leave the kitchen. Laurel exchanged a glance with Paul, stepped back to his side, and said, I'm glad we're together, at least. Me too. He swept his lips along her hairline. Your family is okay? Nantucket sounded their siren too, and they're running every ferry they have back to Hyannis. It's only an hour-long trip, and in the same direction as the tsunami. Then they have a hotel in town, with hopefully a high-floor room. They said they'd call as soon as they were on the mainland. Good, Paul said. He squeezed her hand as they stepped into a beautiful industrial kitchen. Paul pulled in a breath. Oh, wow. Laurel was in shock about cooking for 50, but Paul was obviously excited about it. Another woman stood there, bent over another clipboard. She looked up and said, I have no idea, Eloise. Do you even have enough food to feed 50 people? Go, Laurel said. Go now, Paul. And she watched with pride and a smile as her boyfriend strode further into the kitchen to see what he could do to help. Chapter 7. Eloise glared at Alice. There's plenty of food here, she said. Maybe she didn't know how to make it into meals to feed everyone at the inn, but there was enough food. The full-time chef she'd hired to serve breakfast and dinner hadn't been able to make it off of Belle Island before the tsunami warning went out, and the worry inside Eloise started to intertwine with the irritation. Did you have a menu? Paul Leahy asked, and Eloise turned toward him. He worked for Erin, and Eloise had met him on several previous occasions. She gave him a quick smile and caught a glance at his girlfriend, Laurel. They both wore their uniforms, as they'd been on duty when the warnings had gone out. Eloise really wished it was Erin standing next to her, wearing his uniform and offering to help. Her stomach lurched, and she pressed one palm into the cool, stainless steel counter beside her. Erin was going to be fine. He knew how to drive in the rain, and their cell phone service still worked. He had a radio besides, and if Eloise didn't hear from him in an hour, she'd sit in one of the 3 other police cars that were parked in front of the Cliffside Inn. Yes, she said. Megan and I went over a menu so I could order all the groceries. She pulled her phone out of the pocket of her black slacks. She'd dressed up today so she could show her friends how professional she could be, a fact she was now regretting, as the loafers she wore weren't quite wide enough for her feet, and her pinky toes existed in a constant state of getting smashed. Let's see, she muttered as she navigated to her email. The seconds seemed to stretch into long threads, and surely Paul would rescind his offer to help if Eloise took much longer to find the email from Megan. I know I have it, she said, her heart starting to pound. This was not the way she'd wanted to kick off having guests in the Cliffside Inn. When it was just going to be her girlfriends and their families, Eloise had been out of her head with nerves. Now she had over 4 dozen people, most of whom she barely knew. Erin knew them all, and if she could hide behind him, Eloise would be fine. He was gone now, though, and the clock had just ticked to 5 o'clock. Here it is, she finally said, landing on the right email. She scanned the message quickly and handed the phone to Paul. It was just going to be me and my friends, though. Maybe we don't have enough food. I think the chief was going to be here through Christmas, though, right? Paul asked, flicking his eyes at her for a moment. You surely have enough for tonight and tomorrow morning. Everyone won't stay forever. Right, Eloise said, though it felt like she couldn't see past the next minute. She'd never experienced a tsunami before, and she simply needed to focus on the moment, deal with whatever came up, and look back after it was all done. Looking back at a crisis was always easier than trying to see through it, and Eloise blinked, trying to focus. Dinner, she told herself. She needed to offer people dinner. Robin and AJ had taken over the front desk and placing people in rooms. Eloise quickly sent a text to the group. Robin and AJ, I asked Connor, one of Aaron's cops, to help with the organization of people, just in case he says anything.
Okay,
Robin said.
people seem to be settling in just fine.
All right, Paul said with a heavy exhale. She was going to make a pumpkin curry soup tonight. Let's get these ingredients out and see how much we can make. Perhaps there's enough to double or triple. Soup goes a long way. Not everyone will eat, besides, Laurel said. Eloise turned toward her, as the woman had come up beside her. You're right. She took a deep breath. Okay, tell us what to find, Paul. He started naming ingredients, and Eloise, Alice, and Laurel claimed it and bustled off to find it. Within minutes, a pile of cans, cream, spices, and 3 rotisserie chickens sat on the cooking station. Paul looked at the recipe and then the ingredients. We can feed people with this. Eloise, it says she was going to serve rolls and salad, too. Right, Eloise said. The rolls are store-bought, and I got 3 dozen. That's not enough for everyone. We can cut some in half, Laurel said. Perhaps some of the children won't need a full roll. They're going to have soup and salad, too, Paul said. It's going to be fine.
Cutting them in half is a good idea, Alice said. I'll find the rolls.
Eloise started toward the big walk-in refrigerator. We got 2 kinds of salad, she said over her shoulder. A broccoli kale one and a classic green salad. She retrieved the bagged salads from the fridge, and she had 4 of each. This is a lot, Paul said, smiling at her. I'm going to get started on the soup. It seems straightforward enough, and I think it'll be done in about 45 minutes. Eloise bent to get out a couple of the big industrial bowls she'd bought. With her hands busy, her mind couldn't linger on Aaron and where he was. She couldn't dial her mother for a 4th time. She couldn't text Kelly or Kristen to find out where they were. She'd never heard back from Kristen, but with the ferry system closing immediately, Eloise didn't think she'd be coming to the inn. Her chest felt like someone had knocked her down, stomped on her breastbone, and refused to let her stand. She reminded herself that Kristen had lived through some terrible storms here in Five Island Cove. The physical kind, with wind, rain, sleet, and waves as tall as the lighthouse. She'd also survived some of the worst personal and emotional storms a person had to go through. And Eloise told herself not to worry about Kristen. It was so very hard, though, because worrying was something Eloise did best. Not only that, but she loved Kristen, and she didn't want anything bad to happen to her. She let her mind roam free as she piled the bags into separate bowls. She'd cut them open, dump them out, and mix everything up closer to when the salads would be eaten. Meanwhile, she got out the pot Paul needed, and she found the can opener, opened the cans of pumpkin, and measured out the half and half they'd add very last. Eloise could do a lot in the kitchen, even if it wasn't putting together a meal for 50. She knew how to make rice, and she set another pot on the stove and measured water, salt, and the white rice into it. She knew how to dice up the meat on a rotisserie chicken, and she did that while Paul sautéed onions and measured spices. Only 10 minutes later, he said, That's it. This boils for 15 minutes, and we add the cream and rice.
Wow,
Alice said.
That's fast.
Paul's a good cook, Laurel said. We took a class once, and he put me to shame. She smiled at him, and it was obvious to Eloise that she really liked Paul. A slip of foolishness moved through Eloise for her behavior toward Laurel. She started toward Alice, who'd been slicing rolls and talking quietly with Laurel. They'd gotten out butter to go with the rolls, found bowls and spoons, as well as small plates for salad and rolls. And as Eloise joined them, Alice asked,
How long have you and Paul been seeing each other?
She wore such a friendly smile, and Eloise wanted to be more like that. Since August, Laurel said, shooting a look at Eloise. They do those cooking classes down by the beach on Diamond. Have you ever done those?
No,
Alice said, still smiling as she piled rolls into a basket Eloise didn't know she owned.
I just moved here permanently in June. and my divorce was final at the end of August.
She spoke in the same smooth, professional voice Eloise had heard her use with clients.
I'm not so sure I'm ready to get back on the dating bandwagon.
Eloise stared at her in surprise. She'd literally accepted a dinner invitation with Will Bridge only a few days ago. Alice ignored her, though, and Eloise kept her mouth shut. It wasn't her place to make Alice tell Laurel, who was a complete stranger to Alice, about her first date after her divorce. It took me a while, Laurel said with a faint smile. She turned away from the other two. Should I find some napkins or paper towels? I have napkins in the pantry, Eloise said, pointing her in the right direction. Alice let her walk away before she said,
Thanks for not saying anything about Will.
Why didn't you say anything about Will? Alice shrugged.
I don't know. Maybe because I haven't told the twins about him yet, and I don't want them to hear it from someone else.
Did you tell Robin that? Eloise asked, catching Laurel headed back their way.
Yes,
Alice said.
Now, where are we going to have everyone eat?
I kept a dining area, Eloise said, but we're putting people in it as a bedroom. But not right now, Laurel said. Should I go check on it? Yes, Eloise said. I'll show you where it is. She gestured for Laurel to come with her. Alice, would you check on the rice?
I don't know anything about rice,
Alice said, a look of panic crossing her face. Then open the salads, Eloise said. Paul, would you check the rice? On it, he called from the stove, and Eloise could see what Laurel liked about him. She exited the kitchen to more noise than she anticipated, which only accelerated her anxiety. The kitchen sat behind the dining room, but Eloise remembered putting someone's luggage against that door. Down the hall, past the chest-high podium she'd installed herself, painted and decorated with a traditional poinsettia flower for the holidays, she turned into the dining area. Several people milled about here, as this was the inn's official lobby. Eloise had envisioned serving cookies during check-in, breakfast every day of the week, and dinner for an added charge per person. She needed to say something to Laurel, as there was a 500-pound gorilla between them. There's a closet over here, she said, stepping past a couple facing one another. Eloise pulled out her keys and fitted the right one into the knob. It twisted easily, as all fixtures in the inn were brand new. She opened the door and stepped into the storage closet, feeling for the light switch on the wall just inside. It snapped on, and Eloise made room for Laurel. Once she'd taken a step inside, Eloise said, Listen, Laurel, I wanted to apologize for my behavior in the fall. Oh, no, Eloise, you don't need to do that. Eloise looked right into the other woman's eyes. Yes, I do. It was not my finest moment, and I hope you know I have no ill feelings for you. She smiled at Laurel, and surprisingly, she meant her words. Laurel nodded, her mouth tight. It was difficult for me as well, she said. I didn't know how to tell my boss no. He shouldn't have put you in that situation, Eloise said. If he does again, you just come tell me, okay? I'll set him straight. She smiled at Laurel, the sudden urge to hug her coming over Eloise. She grabbed onto Laurel, who sucked in a breath. A moment later, though, she eased into Eloise's hug. Thank you for being so forgiving, she whispered. Nothing to forgive, Laurel said quietly. She stepped away a moment later. Are the chief's children here? If you need help with them until he gets back, Paul and I can help. We both know them, and they know us. They're in my apartment, she said. Robin's youngest is hanging out with them. Oh, you have an apartment here? It's a tiny one-bedroom area behind the inn, she said, just enough for the caretaker. I think I'm going to have my chef live in it, actually. I haven't decided yet. She didn't like thinking about all the details she hadn't worked out yet, and this trial by fire wouldn't help her make them. The situation was so unique, and Eloise hoped she never had to relive it. I don't know if I have enough tables and chairs for everyone. She turned to face the folded tables. They can eat in shifts. Laurel said. "Let's get out what you have." They started pulling out the first table when Charlie and Mandy joined them. "My mother sent us to help," Charlie said, taking Laurel's end of the table.
"I'll get the chairs,"
Mandy said. Together, the four of them got the tables and chairs set up. Eloise moved the luggage in front of the door leading into the kitchen, and she opened that door and called to Alice. She brought out the rolls, and Eloise and Laurel went to get the plates, utensils, and salads. Charlie and Mandy asked everyone to please move out of the lobby area so there was room for people to form a line, and Charlie stood at the head of the line. "Now we just need to let people know it's ready," Paul said as he brought out a giant pot of soup. It was pale orange and smelled like garlic, pumpkin, and curry, and Eloise's mouth watered. She didn't think she'd be able to eat much, as tight as her nerves were, but she hoped someone would. "Oh, I have a speaker system," Eloise said, turning to run off to the public address system she'd had installed just 3 weeks ago.
"Put a basket at the end of the table,"
Alice said before Eloise got too far.
"She should collect donations for meals like this. The food isn't free."
Eloise wanted to disagree, but she let Alice do what she wanted, because she was right. The food wasn't free, and while Eloise hadn't planned on charging her friends for the next several nights they'd stay at the inn, she was sure she'd have gotten offers from all of them to help with the food. She bustled to the back of the inn, to the system just inside the back door that led out to the patio and the pool. The sun was completely gone now, though darkness hadn't stolen all the light from twilight yet. Eloise took a moment to look out into the soupy atmosphere. Once, she'd stood out back here and looked down at the house she'd hated. She wondered if she'd be able to see it tonight. Shaking herself, she picked up the phone and dialed *9. "Good evening," she said, channeling her inner Alice. "For anyone who's hungry, we have a delicious pumpkin curry soup downstairs in the dining room. There are 2 types of salad and rolls with butter. We ask that you only take what you can actually eat so that we have enough for all who desire to eat tonight." She drew in a deep breath as the door to her apartment opened and Billy and Grace appeared with Jamie. Her heart expanded, as she loved those girls so much. "We ask that rooms 1 through 7 come eat first, while those of you in 8 through 14 wait about 20 minutes to allow room in the dining room. If you are not assigned a room, please come at your convenience. There is enough food for all." She nodded as if anyone could see her and hung up. She immediately moved outside and gathered her soon-to-be stepdaughters into a double hug. "How are you guys? Hungry?"
"Yes,"
Grace said, gripping Eloise tightly. Even Billy clung to her, and Eloise pressed her eyes closed. "Did you tell Jamie thanks for staying with you?"
"Thank you,"
Grace said as she stepped back from Eloise. Eloise straightened and kept her arm around Billy, who looked up at her. She was getting taller, and she was so beautiful and so wise.
"Where's my dad?"
she asked. Eloise swallowed, as she wouldn't be able to live with herself if anything happened to Aaron. "He went down to my mother's to help her," she said. "He's going to meet Kelly and Parker there, too. Then they'll be back." She put a smile on her face, but it felt all wrong. She let it slip away as they went inside, and Eloise paused on the threshold of the inn. "I'm going to grab something from my apartment," she said. "You guys go ahead. I'll be right there." She watched the 3 girls go around the corner, and then she turned back to the patio. She crossed it and went past the pool, too. To the very edge of the yard she went, and Eloise folded her arms across her chest as she looked down the cliffs to the rest of Sanctuary Island. She'd stood here before, and she'd been able to see all the way to the beaches, watch the ferries come in and go out, and gaze across the ocean toward Boston. Tonight, she didn't try to see any of those things. All she wanted to see was her mother's house, and she wished Aaron would turn on the flashing red and blue lights on the top of the car. She pulled out her phone and called him, relieved when the call went through. The line just rang and rang and rang, though, which did nothing to soothe the flurry of bat wings flapping in Eloise's stomach. "Please stay safe," she whispered into the night, unable to find her mother's house in the soupy atmosphere in front of her. Please. Chapter 8. AJ lay in Matt's arms on the couch in one of the rooms inside the Cliffside Inn. Robin and Alice lay in the same bed, only Robin's face illuminated by the bright blue-white light of her phone. Every so often, she'd turn her face toward Alice and whisper something, to which Alice would respond. No one was sleeping, and AJ couldn't even get herself to swallow. Their room was on the ground floor, and if the waves of the tsunami reached this high, they'd get wet before anyone on the second or third floor. She shifted, and Matt's arms around her tightened. Scared? He whispered, and AJ could only nod. Me too, he said. I've never been through anything like this. I had to hunker down during a hurricane a couple of times, AJ said. In Miami. We knew it was coming, though, and we boarded everything up. We gathered in the middle of the dorms, which were made of cinder blocks. We were fairly far inland, too, and while our apartment complex had downed trees and a few broken windows, we barely even knew the storm had come and gone. I've been through one hurricane in New York City, he said. It was so strange not to see people on the streets. The whole building swayed, and the 5 of us huddled in a coat closet with flashlights and go fish. Your children must have been young, she said, leaning back into his chest a little further. He'd been nothing but loving and kind since she'd shown up on his doorstep with her luggage and the news of their pregnancy. He'd told her she could stay with him, and she'd spent the next few days researching doctors and then making her first appointment. She'd been told her pregnancy was automatically high risk because of her age, and AJ didn't quite know how to cope with the stress that had been added to her plate. This tsunami certainly wasn't helping her to relax. She'd also had to go off her antidepressants and her ADD medication, and she felt like she was currently on a child's swing set. One moment she was fine, and all of her thoughts were aligned and working together. The next she was swooping downward, unable to remember what she was working on, or even saying sometimes. Matt had finally asked her what was going on, and she'd admitted to going off her anti-anxiety medication, as well as the pills that helped her focus and kept her attention in a normal sphere. She didn't feel like herself without the meds, and she didn't know what that said about her. What she knew was that she could hardly sleep, tsunami notwithstanding, and that the past 9 days since she'd landed in the cove with the news of the life inside her had been some of the hardest of her life. She didn't want to risk her pregnancy, and she didn't want to give birth to an underweight, possibly lethargic infant that could go through some major withdrawal symptoms. She could weather this personal storm for 9 months. You can, she told herself again. She had to remind herself of that every few minutes, it seemed, and tears pressed behind AJ's eyes. The children were very young, Matt said. Justin was only 3. That makes Derek 6? AJ guessed. Yes, Matt said. And Lisa would have been 8. She was almost 9, but yes, Matt said, placing his lips right against AJ's neck. She pressed into the touch, almost desperate for him to keep kissing her. She could get lost inside the physicality of making love in a way that quieted her mind like nothing else ever had. That was why she'd let boys into her life as much as she had. If she could just get her thoughts to settle down, then she'd know what to do next. She knew how to kiss a man and where to put her hands. She knew exactly what to do in bed, and that didn't require her mind to work at all. It somehow freed her up to be able to make better decisions in other areas of her life. Someone shifted in the bed across the room, and AJ heard Alice talking to Charlie. All of the other teens and kids were staying in Eloise's apartment with her and a couple of Aaron's cops. The 3 of them would absolutely be awake, as Aaron Sherman had not returned to the inn yet. He'd been gone for almost 5 hours now, and Eloise had been in tears when she'd hugged Alice, Robin, and then AJ, and gone with 3 of his cops and all the kids. Because Aaron wasn't back, Eloise's mother wasn't in the inn either, and Kelly and Parker also hadn't arrived yet. AJ pulled her phone from under her hip and looked at it. Her last 10 messages to Kelly had gone unanswered, and her own worry felt like a boulder in the back of her throat. AJ? Matt whispered. Hmm? I'm in love with you. His breath wafted hotly across her shoulder, and she imagined him ducking his head shyly as he made his confession. AJ stilled, all of the scattered pieces of her life suddenly coming together. Really? He chuckled almost silently against the back of her neck. I've been in love with you for almost 30 years. You can't be that surprised. She twisted in his arms to face him, placing the bright screen of her phone against his shoulder blade. It was too dark to see all the fine features of his face, but she searched anyway. She'd been in love before, and as she tried to define her own feelings, she realized she loved him too. I love you too, she said. Do you want to get married? He asked. We can make a life right here in the Cove and raise our baby together. AJ had once scoffed at anyone who wanted to settle down and have a quiet life in Five Island Cove. She had never wanted that, and she'd done everything she could to set her life here in the Cove on fire. She'd been in town for 8 days and still not even called her father. Amelia, likewise, lived on Pearl Island, and they'd probably both like to see AJ and find out how she was doing. She hadn't texted them when the tsunami warning went out, and sudden regret reached right around her throat and squeezed. Matt kissed her, but AJ already couldn't breathe, and she pulled away. Don't cry, he whispered. AJ had a lot to cry about, though, and she buried her face in his chest. His hands ran up and down her back, and he started to hum. She wasn't sure how much time had gone by before Alice said, Is she okay? Maybe she should get up for a second. Strong hands lifted her, and Matt said, AJ, baby, can you stand up? She rolled, glad Alice and Charlie were there to help her. I'm okay, she said. Sorry, I didn't even text my father. What if he's still in that stupid cottage on the beach? Why can't I call and face him? She hadn't been the nicest to her father once she'd left the islands. She knew that. She'd wanted nothing to do with Five Island Cove, and that included all the people who still lived here. The real problem lay in her genes, and AJ didn't want to admit that she was more like her mother than she should be. Her mom had abandoned her and her siblings when AJ was just 10 years old, and she barely remembered the woman. She had taught AJ how easy it was to walk away from anything unpleasant in her life, and a fresh set of tears rolled down her face. AJ. Alice took her into a strong grip. Low voices spoke around her, and AJ knew they were talking about her. Fear gripped her heart because she didn't want Alice to know she was pregnant. She hadn't told anyone except Matt, and she wanted to talk to her friends when she was ready, and not a moment sooner. Mom? Charlie said, and that single word broke the haze in AJ's mind. She turned toward the teenager. Did you feel that? AJ hadn't felt anything, but all 5 of them moved over to the window. Only darkness stretched beyond them, with a burst of light to the right, where an outside spotlight shone onto the front lawn of the inn. Robin looked at her phone. It's 9:24. It could be here. Charlie reached down and opened the window a couple of inches, and a horrible chill came inside. A low, rushing, hissing sound filled the air, and it sounded very much like the roar of the ocean waves. It's here, AJ said, her voice deathly quiet and hollow. She reached for Matt at the same time he wove his arm around her waist. Alice took her hand, and AJ squeezed her fingers. They all stood there, gathered around the window, waiting for their fate to arrive.
Dear Lord, Robin whispered, hear our pleas for safety and the preservation of our lives. Bless my children with Eloise. Bless Eloise and this beautiful inn. Bless my husband who is on lower ground. She continued to pray for every person she knew, and AJ found herself mentally adding her own prayers for her sister and her father to Robin's vocalized prayer. Robin had not finished speaking and had not said amen when a horrible, terrible crunching and crackling sound filled the air. All 5 of them made some sort of noise, and AJ's mind went wild. She imagined the very earth itself cracking and shedding off into the dark, dangerous waters below, and she had no recourse but to go with it. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and she shrieked, though it wasn't a violent enough shake to even make her sway. It stopped only a second later, but AJ could still imagine the whole island sinking into the sea. Dear Lord, Alice said, her voice shaking as much as the earth just had. Keep Aaron Sherman safe. Where is he? AJ asked. Why isn't he back? She gripped her phone and lifted it to her face. She jabbed at Kelly's name. We have to get in touch with Kelly. Panic gripped her lungs, and AJ struggled to breathe against the tension there. The phone connected, but it just rang and rang and rang. Beside her, Matt muttered something that sounded very much like a plea to God to keep his parents safe if at all possible, and AJ lowered her phone while it continued to ring, adding her voice to the 4 people already praying as they stood in front of the window. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, and all anyone could do was wait to see where they'd land on the other side of the tsunami. Pray. Chapter 9. Kelly gripped Parker's hand as Aaron kept going up the road. It had taken her a very long time to get to Sanctuary Island, much longer than the 37 minutes it should have taken. The ferry was one that bypassed Diamond and went from Belle to Sanctuary. There had almost been an uprising when the conductor had stuck to the route instead of going to the nearest ferry station, as the emergency information had said they would. Kelly had been secretly glad, but the ferry had floated in the water for a very long time while the conductor was on the radio with his manager. By the time they'd reached Sanctuary, the sun was all the way down, and the rideshare station was closed. She and countless others had stood there for a long time, all of them requesting rides on their apps and getting denied. Kelly pulled back on the tears for at least the 10th time since those texts had gone out, over 5 hours ago. She couldn't believe the waves hadn't doused the cove yet, and she wondered if the tsunami was real. The anxiety and tension in her body told her it was, but Kelly had been known to worry about nothing in the past. She'd stayed in contact with Aaron Sherman because if she missed him, she'd never get up to the inn, and she couldn't hunker down in her beach house, the one only 100 yards from the ocean as it was. Her chest constricted, and she couldn't wait to tell her friends what she'd done at the ferry station. She could barely believe it, and AJ would fall down dead when Kelly told her she'd legitimately picked up a rock from the frozen landscaping at the ferry station and thrown it through a window. A sense of pride touched her soul, though, because Kelly was done playing the weak link. She wasn't going to be a woman who stood on the sidelines of her life anymore. And as she'd looked down the line of people who needed a ride, she'd determined to make sure they got one. She could see herself stepping out of line and calling down it. Who here knows how to hotwire a car? Who here has a car we can borrow? One man had stepped out of the line, towing his little girl with him. She hadn't been bigger than a kindergartner, and he'd never let go of her while Kelly gave her backpack and purse to Parker and broken that window. She'd gotten the passenger van unlocked, and her new friend Ted had gotten it started. They filled it with as many people as possible, and Kelly drove them around Sanctuary Island to the safety of their homes. She'd dropped Parker off at Don Hall's house, where Aaron joined her in the quest to get everyone away from the ferry station and into a better position of safety. They'd finished after a couple of hours, and then Aaron's car had run out of gas.
Challenge after challenge had run through Kelly's mind, and she wasn't going to let a little thing like gasoline prevent her from achieving her goals. She'd gone to a closed convenience store and broken another window. She'd confessed everything to Aaron, and he'd assured her he wouldn't let anything bad happen to her. She was willing to pay for the windows and repairs for the damage she'd caused. She still couldn't believe she'd broken 2 windows that night, and she flexed her fingers in the darkness as Aaron took a corner a little bit too fast. Dawn sat in the front passenger seat, and Parker's thigh pressed into Kelly's right one, both of them huddled behind the chief as he drove toward the inn. After she'd filled a gas can with gas, helped the chief get it in the police car, and they'd picked up Dawn and Parker, they'd finally started their exodus up the mountain. Exhaustion filled Kelly once and then twice, but the night wasn't over yet. Her phone had died hours ago, and the only reason she'd been able to find Aaron and help him was because the passenger van belonged to a senior citizen center and had a radio. A blessing, she thought, as they passed a house that had all the lights on. She caught a shadow in the window, and she understood the sheer anxiety she could feel in the scene. She could see herself standing at a window, peering out, wondering when disaster was going to strike. Kelly felt like it had struck her life several times, and she pressed her eyes closed and prayed for a miracle. Her father had lost his business. Their family had fallen apart. Kelly had dealt with infertility, mental unrest, and feelings of unworthiness. She'd endured first a cheating husband, and then one who wanted an open relationship with 2 women. It was said that lightning didn't strike the same place twice, but she'd felt its hot torch of disappointment and despair in her life several times. She wasn't sure if she could handle another disaster. Yes, you can, she told herself, feeling her spine straighten and strengthen. She could do anything. She'd broken a window in a van tonight and driven over 24 people to safety. She was going to weather whatever this storm brought her way. The car swayed, and something beneath it rumbled, and she and Aaron said, "Whoa," at the same time. In the next moment, he gunned the engine, adding, "We have to make it past this." She couldn't see out the window to know what "this" was, but she reached up to grab onto the handle above the window as the car started to slide. A shriek came out of her mouth, and Parker started to cry as the car turned sideways and slid. Kelly's mind raced. Small, short thoughts hit her mind. We're going over the side. We're literally going to fall off the cliff. This is it. I love you, Parker. Everything slowed down but moved so fast at the same time. She tried to keep her body upright, but it was useless, and she felt like she was on one of those carnival rides where the centrifugal force forced everyone to the outside edge of the car. Parker smashed into her, and she leaned her whole body weight into the car door. "Aaron!" Dawn yelled, and then she screamed as something heavy slammed into the side of the car. The car spun. Kelly closed her eyes and let her body's involuntary functions take over. She couldn't think. Only a moment later, the police cruiser came to a stop, and all Kelly could hear was the labored breathing of the 4 people in the car. Dawn whimpered, and Aaron said, "Talk to me, Dawn." He spoke in an authoritative tone, but his voice was made mostly of air. "It's my leg," she said. It got smashed when that boulder hit us." "Boulder?" Kelly asked. "It was a landslide," Aaron said, his voice still somewhat breathless. "We're not getting up to the inn tonight." He reached for the radio and pressed the button. "Paul, this is Aaron. Come back." Silence filled the car. "Paul, this is Aaron. Come back." He tried again, and no one answered him. "I think the radio is out," Parker said. "There's not even static coming through, Aaron." "You're right," Aaron said, finally replacing the mouthpiece. "I don't think we can stay here. Let's see if I can get us back to Dawn's." He put the car in gear, and it shuddered, but it moved. Kelly finally took a breath that was more than a gasp, but her worry hadn't gone anywhere. Aaron swore right out loud, and she didn't have time to reprimand him to watch his language in front of her son. His next words were, The water is coming right at us. Kelly strained to see over the seat and past the metal mesh that separated the front seat from the back, where criminals usually rode. She couldn't see much, and she couldn't believe Aaron was going to drive into that. There was a house right there, Kelly said, remembering the shadow in the window. Maybe they'll let us hunker down with them. Where? Aaron asked, pressing on the brake. It was right here somewhere, Kelly said, her confidence for the night shot. Maybe right around the corner? How fast is the water rising? Fast enough, Aaron said, easing the car forward. They bumped over debris in the road, and the lights from the house Kelly had seen came into view. It was honestly like a mirage in a desert, or manna from heaven. Aaron pulled right up onto the lawn and jumped from the car. He opened Kelly's door and said, "You're okay? You can get Parker inside?" "Yes," she said, spilling out of the cruiser. "Get Dawn." Kelly turned back to grab her son, and they ran up the few steps to the door and pounded on it. "Help!" she yelled. "We need help!" The door opened a moment later, as if the watcher at the window had been waiting just for them. "Come in," a woman said, reaching for Parker. Kelly passed her son over and turned around. Behind her, Kelly saw the lights from the house glinting on dark water, and she darted down the steps to help Aaron with Dawn. Kelly was not going to let anything happen to Eloise's mother or fiancé. That was for dang sure. "I'll get the cats." She yanked open the back door and grabbed the cat carriers, both cats yowling their displeasure of the last 20 minutes. Aaron had Dawn out now, and Kelly swept to her right side and buoyed her up as they all shuffled up the steps in a painfully slow way. "Parker," she barked, "come get the cats." Her son did as she asked, and a man had joined the woman on the porch. He took over Kelly's spot in helping Dawn, and the woman said, "Hurry, the water is coming." They made it inside, and she closed the door behind them. "Stacy," she said, "help me seal it." Another adult woman came forward, and they both knelt on the floor while Kelly tried to catch her breath, and they pressed a thick, black plastic along the seams of the door. Kelly glanced around, seeing the black plastic everywhere. She wondered if that worked, but she didn't have time to fully consider it right now. "Second floor?" Aaron asked. "I need a first aid kit, too. Any painkiller you've got. She needs somewhere to sit and put her leg up." "Upstairs, Chief," the man said. "We have a lounger in the loft she can sit in." "She's bleeding," Aaron said. "I'll pay for whatever I have to." "It's no problem," he said. "I'm Malcolm, and we're glad to help." That started the introductions, and Kelly met Malcolm and Tara Bent, their daughter, Stacy, and her husband, Jake. They had a baby who was blissfully asleep in a crib on the second floor. Kelly herded Parker in front of her as she told them all of their names, including Aaron's and Dawn's. When she made it upstairs, she found Dawn lowering herself into a recliner, a wince of extreme pain on her face. Aaron and Malcolm adjusted the footrest, and Dawn's leg shook as it lay there. Kelly saw the blood above her knee, and then she turned Parker away. "You can go into the extra bedroom there," Tara said. "There are blankets and everything." "Thank you," Kelly murmured, wishing she'd thought to grab her backpack or purse from the car. She needed to charge her phone. She needed to text her friends. She needed to find out if the tsunami was going to hit Boston or New York, and if the water would get all the way to Newark. She couldn't believe she was thinking about and concerned for Julian's safety, but she was. He was the father of her son, and she did love him on some level. She turned toward Parker and said, "You can crawl right into bed there, buddy." "Should I change?" he asked. "No," she said. "I left my backpack." She cut off as he lifted it up. A smile touched her face despite the events of that night. "You smart boy." She hugged him tightly, barely able to hold back her tears. She was about to collapse, and she told herself to hang on for just a little bit longer. Just a little bit longer. 5 minutes, then 5 more. "No," she finally said. "Stay dressed, bud. We have no idea if this is over yet." He nodded, and Kelly took precious moments to dig through the bag to find her phone charger. She did, and she plugged in her phone before she stepped over to the window to check on the depth of the water. If it reached all the way to the cliffside inn, this house would be completely submerged underwater. She looked out the window, the headlights of the police car flickering as the water started to reach the engine. It was at least 20 feet below where she stood, and as she watched, it didn't seem to be getting much higher than it already was. Beyond the doorway, she heard Dawn suck in a breath through her teeth, and Kelly's motherly instincts told her to go check on Eloise's mother. Then she could make a proper report when her phone had enough charge to make a call. Out in the loft, Aaron knelt at Dawn's right side, focused on her injury. He worked swiftly and with steady hands. He finished cleaning the wound, and that addition of alcohol had probably been why she'd gasped. "All clean," he said in a calm, soothing voice. "I'm going to put this antibacterial cream on it and cover it up." "Okay," Dawn said, her voice high-pitched. Aaron did that and stood, pure exhaustion on his face. "Here are some of my looser pants," Tara said, and Aaron took them from her, a bit of apprehension in those eyes now. "I'll help her," Kelly said, moving forward. "Will you go see if you can get in touch with anyone up at the inn and let them know what's happening with us?" "Yes," Aaron said, handing her the pants. "Thank you, Kelly." He took her into a hug and held her tight. "You've been so amazing tonight." "So have you," she said, surprised at the level of emotion and relief in the usually strong, stoic chief's voice. "I'll go see if I can get in touch with Eloise." He bent down and hugged Dawn, too. "Okay? I know she'll be worried." "She's strong, too," Dawn said. "Thank you, Aaron. I'm so glad she found you." "Oh, I'm the lucky one," Aaron said as he straightened, a smile on his face. It disappeared quickly as he turned toward the steps. "I'm going to run down and see if—" "The water is on the porch," Malcolm said, blocking his way. "You're not going outside and you're not going downstairs." Aaron blinked at him, but he didn't argue with Malcolm. "I'll try my phone. Thank you so much, Malcolm." He reached out and shook the man's hand, then retreated to a corner of the loft. "Come on, Dawn," Kelly said. "Let's get you up and into this bedroom." Chapter 10. The sun rose slowly but steadily. Robin stood on the front porch at the inn and watched it crest the horizon. The ocean to the east rippled slightly, but otherwise didn't show any signs of a wall of water having moved through the cove only 10 hours ago. No water had come up to the inn, a fact that had allowed Robin to get a few hours of sleep in the quietest parts of the night. She hadn't been able to get in touch with Duke yet, but she kept her phone under her arm. He'd stayed at their house, as he'd been planning to come to the inn on Monday, after a weekend of fishing with Brian. All of the boats had probably been damaged beyond repair after last night's wall of water had hit the cove. Robin had woken to a world without power, and it had been off for hours now. Her phone had charged most of the night, but she couldn't help thinking any calls or texts she tried to get through would simply fail. She clung to a tiny thread of hope that the tsunami hadn't been too bad. After all, it hadn't even reached the inn. Then where's Aaron? She asked herself, looking automatically to the 2 police cars sitting in the driveway of the inn. Paul, Laurel, and Connor had been inside the cars for most of the night, trying to get in touch with him, or anyone else on the force. They hadn't been able to, and the logical conclusion, at least to Robin, was that their radio system was down. That, or else the station had been wiped out, all the other cars in the entire fleet were damaged or underwater, and they'd entered the apocalypse. The walkie-talkie in her back pocket beeped, and Robin jumped as she hurried to reach for it. "Robin," Duke's voice said. "Are you in the morning?" He sounded somewhat upbeat, but the most important thing was that he was still alive. Pure relief rushed through her, and she depressed the button as she brought the walkie to her mouth. "I'm here," she said. "Tell me everything." "The house is okay," he said. We've got some standing water in the backyard, and some has seeped into the kitchen and living room. I swept it all out, and I have fans blowing to get it dry.
Wow, Robin said. That's all?
The carpet is probably ruined,
Duke said.
It's not like the water was clean.
Robin pressed her lips together and added living room carpet to their growing list of things they needed to replace. She felt like the heavens had opened up and the rain streamed down. While that happened, a hurricane approached, and then an earthquake threw another wrench into Robin's life.
Brian and I just got to the dock. It looks like a giant reached down and picked up every boat, crushed them in his fist, and dropped all the timber in a pile.
The Lady Hawk? Robin asked, part of her heart dying a little bit because she already knew what Duke was going to say.
She's gone, Robin,
Duke said. Why do you sound so happy about it? Robin asked as someone stepped out onto the porch with her. She turned toward Alice, wishing she didn't have to have this conversation in front of anyone. It's Alice, she told herself. She'd put her house up for sale so she could support herself and her children with her own income. She'd gotten rid of her car, and she'd only kept the sensible sedan her kids used from time to time.
I'm not happy about it,
Duke said.
But the insurance will pay out now, no questions asked.
Robin met Alice's eyes, and she raised her eyebrows as if to say, he's got a point. You always see the silver lining, Robin said. Duke chuckled.
How did you fare over there?
The water didn't reach us here, she said. The biggest issue right now is locating Aaron, Kelly, and Parker and Eloise's mother. We haven't heard from or seen them since last night.
Oh, no,
Duke said, and he sounded genuinely upset.
What can I do?
I don't know, Robin said. I think the ferries will be down for at least today. Alice nodded and gestured to her phone. Robin had no idea what she was saying, and she held up her hand to get her to stop. The girls and I are fine. We arrived without any issues, and we have plenty to eat here. We've got a bed, and it's decently warm, though the power is out.
I'm glad,
Duke said.
We still have power here, but So I'll do that tomorrow.
I'm losing you, Robin said. I can't hear everything. When she released the button, she expected to hear Duke's voice again, but she didn't. Only dead air came through the line. A crackle of static, where she thought she'd get him again, but she didn't. She lowered the walkie-talkie as she admitted defeat. What were you trying to say? She asked Alice. They updated the web page, she said. The ferries won't reopen until tomorrow morning. She faced the sun as the golden rays of light rose higher into the sky, and Robin turned her face into the light and warmth, too. What else did they say? The wall of water was 21 feet. That's not too bad, Robin said. The lighthouse is taller than that, right? Right, Alice murmured. She hugged herself and drew in a deep breath. They say it slowed because the cove has a shallow rim of water around it. That usually makes the water rise higher, but it didn't have time. They stood together in silence for a minute, and Robin was glad they were together. Have you heard from Kristen? No. Robin shook her head. I'm sure she's okay. Instead of going high, they go underground. I think they'll be okay. It's going to get cold in the inn, Alice said, if we can't get the power on. Robin had bigger problems than the power being out. Duke lost his boat. I figured. Alice put her arm around Robin. I'm so sorry, Robin. What will you do? He'll file with the insurance company, but they're not fast, Alice. We have no money to buy a replacement boat until the insurance comes through, and by then we'll have nothing. Alice said nothing. And that same feeling filled Robin. She hated feeling nothing. Nothing didn't spur action. Nothing didn't help her find a solution. Nothing literally did nothing for her. At the same time, she couldn't get herself to care about the boat right now. Where do you think Kelly and Parker are? She whispered, leaning into Alice's embrace a little further. I don't know, Alice murmured back. Last I heard, she was on the ferry. Yeah. Robin let her imagination run away with her.
and she couldn't stand the thought of one of her best friends being swept out to sea on a ferry. I bet she's so scared. Kelly was a wonderful woman, but she was quite a bit more fragile than any of the rest of them, and terrified of the water.
Probably, Alice said, like the rest of us standing at that window last night.
Even AJ said a prayer, Robin said, and she straightened to meet Alice's eyes. They grinned at one another, and their laughter spilled out of their mouths at the same time. Once they'd sobered, Robin twisted to look at the door behind her. There's something going on with her and Matt.
I'm sure there is, Alice said. When have you known AJ to not have something going on with the man she's seeing?
I don't mean sex, Robin said quietly. Something else.
You think so?
Alice asked, looking toward the police cars as Paul got out of the nearest one. Yes, Robin said, as he called to them.
Where's Eloise? I have the chief on the radio.
Robin's breath hitched in her chest again. Her pulse kicked into high gear, and she practically flew down the steps. I'll get her! She jogged around the inn to the back apartment. Eloise! She called. She and the officers had taken all of the kids, as they could sleep anywhere, and Eloise had a lot of floor, just not a lot of bedrooms. Eloise! She said, barging into the apartment. She stood in the kitchen, a spatula in one hand and holding the handle of a pan in the other as she fried eggs. Paul has Aaron on the radio. Eloise's eyes widened, and she dropped the spatula and rushed toward Robin, her expression filled with hope and horror at the same time. Chapter 11. Eloise hadn't realized she'd be getting a big, huge family of officers when she'd started dating Aaron. He'd already given her 2 beautiful daughters and a set of parents that didn't scream at each other or hit one another. He'd given her an entirely new reason to keep living her life and doing the best she could, and her heartbeat hadn't been right since he'd left last night. As she slid into the front passenger seat of the police car where Paul Leahy sat behind the wheel, Eloise knew she'd gained more than she even knew. Paul loved and cared about Aaron, as did Laurel Baker and Connor Moon, and every single cop currently standing around the car. Despite the cold temperatures, all the windows were down, and Eloise knew it was so everyone could hear Aaron's report. Robin, Alice, and AJ crowded around, and Grace and Billy climbed into the back with Laurel.
Go ahead, Chief,
Paul said into the radio.
Eloise and the girls just got in the car. Everyone's there, right?
Aaron asked, and just hearing his voice made Eloise's eyes fill with tears. He was all right enough to speak. He could supposedly walk well enough to get to a car.
Yep,
Paul said.
You have the whole force assigned to Sanctuary, so maybe don't say anything you don't want us all to hear.
He grinned at Eloise, and she smiled back at him, her heart opening to him in a whole new way. All of these people loved Aaron as much as she did, and that bonded them in a way she hadn't anticipated or even thought about.
Hey, sweetheart,
Aaron said, and the line clicked. Paul handed her the mouthpiece.
You just hold that button in as you speak.
Eloise nodded and pressed the button, her throat so dry. Hey, Aaron, I'm here, she said, quickly letting go of the button. His chuckle came through the car, and Eloise warmed from the inside out.
It's so good to hear your voice. I love you, and I can't wait to marry you.
Paul started to chuckle too, and Eloise couldn't stop smiling.
I suppose you want an update on what happened,
he said. Eloise nodded, but she didn't need to take precious seconds to press the button and say so.
It was one of the craziest nights ever,
he said.
Kelly came in on another ferry after all the others. It apparently didn't go to Diamond the way it was supposed to, and there was suddenly another 100 people or so right there on the beach.
After we cleared the lot? Laurel asked, and Eloise tried to hand her the radio, but she forgot about the protective guard between the front seat and the back, and she knocked her knuckles against the metal mesh. It's fine, Laurel said as Aaron started to talk again.
They waited in the rideshare line, and they were all using the app to call for a ride, and no one came.
Oh my, Eloise said, trying to imagine herself in that situation.
You'll never believe this,
Erin said, laughing again.
but Kelly took charge. She broke into a van, and she and another man drove everyone in the line to where they needed to go.
Eloise's eyes widened, and she turned to look at Alice, Robin, and AJ. They all looked equally stunned, especially Robin. AJ started to laugh a moment later, and she shook her head as she did.
She was very late getting to your mother's, but she'd texted me and I went to help.
Of course he did, Eloise said.
With the two of us, we got everyone home. Then I ran out of gas, if you can believe it.
I believe it, Robin said. Seems like everything bad that could happen did happen. Eloise agreed, but she didn't press the button to talk. She didn't want to miss a word of Erin's story. He went on to say they'd then gone back to her mother's to get Parker and her mom, and they'd started up the road.
It was dark,
Erin said, his voice lower now.
About 9:30.
Eloise pulled in a breath and held it. She'd been awake when the island had shaken right down to the foundation. It had happened just after 9:30.
What's it like up there?
He asked without continuing. Eloise lifted the radio to her mouth and pushed the button. Normal, she said. The water didn't come this high. The inn is fine, no damage. Eloise had been outside checking on everything from the empty pool to the shingles on the roof to the fenced volleyball court and grassy area down the steps from the patio. It almost seems like nothing happened at all. She'd stood at the top of the hill, though, and she'd been able to locate her childhood home. It looked different in the winter, with the trees leafless and a cold steel color against the weak blue sky. Once I looked down toward the beach, though, I could tell something happened.
What did it look like?
Erin asked. I don't know, Eloise said quietly. I could tell there'd been a storm surge. The water's foamy and... She swallowed because she couldn't even imagine having to clean up after a disaster like this. It seemed like there were some fresh wounds on the earth, she said. Places that normally didn't see the sun because a house or barn used to be there but wasn't anymore. The road was black in places where the water had touched, and the parking lot at the ferry station is still covered in water. Eloise became aware of how articulately she'd spoken, and what horror her words had conveyed. She hadn't been able to see Kelly's row of beach bungalows from her vantage point on the cliff, but she didn't have much hope for them. Not with the ferry station as it was. She released the button to hear Erin saying,
Wanted to stay in the station. I'm so glad they didn't.
He sighed and continued with,
I'm glad there's no damage at the inn, baby. That's so great.
He wore a smile in the words, and Eloise fell a little bit more in love with him.
Anyway,
he said, clearing his throat,
we obviously didn't make it back to the inn. We got hit in the landslide.
Eloise's ears started to ring, blurring Erin's story of seeing the landslide and trying to turn into it so he could go back down. The car had been hit. They slid. He'd finally gotten the cruiser to limp along.
But we couldn't get back to your mother's either,
he said, his voice haunted and hardly his own.
The water was coming up.
Eloise pressed her eyes closed and let the darkness of last night fill her mind. Rocks coming down at her from one side, water rising on the other, a cliff against the third.
Kelly had spotted a house, and we made it there. The Bents took us in, gave us food and medical supplies, somewhere to sleep on the second floor.
Eloise wanted him to continue, but she pressed the button and said, Medical supplies?
Baby, don't freak out, okay?
Eloise was already freaking out. Starting a story like that only caused a person to freak out, and she wished she had Billy or Grace next to her so she could squeeze their hands.
Your mother was on the side of the car that got hit. I'm fairly sure her leg is broken, but I'm no medical doctor. She can't put any weight on it. Kelly and I dressed the outside wound, gave her painkillers, and sat with her all night. She doesn't have a fever, and there's no infection. But wow, the swelling. I'm almost sure it's broken.
A sob had gathered in Eloise's throat while he spoke, and she held it back as long as she could. As it came out, Paul reached over and squeezed her shoulder. "It's okay, Eloise," Robin said, leaning into the window. "She'll come up here and we'll take care of her." Eloise nodded as Alice affirmed that. Of course her friends would step in and help her. In the grand scheme of things, a broken leg wasn't that big of a deal. The landslide could have pushed the whole car off the cliff, and she'd have lost her fiancé and her mother in a single breath. She drew in a breath and pressed the button. "Thank goodness you were with her, Aaron."
It was Kelly who said her leg was broken. I guess she saw a woman at the gym once with a broken leg and it looked just like your mom's.
"What are the chances of getting her to the clinic?" Eloise asked. She couldn't see the emergency care clinic from the inn either, and Five Island Cove only had a full-blown hospital on Diamond Island.
I'm trying to get her to go now,
Aaron said.
Not sure if you're aware, sweetheart, but your mother is really stubborn.
Eloise giggled, especially when Aaron said,
Now I see where you get it.
She sobered quickly, though, because her mom's stubbornness wasn't what was keeping her from going to the clinic. She hated that she had her friends and a large portion of Aaron's cops milling about, listening to the story, but some things couldn't be helped. "Baby," she said quietly, lowering her head as if that would save some of her mother's pride. Some of hers, too. "Mom doesn't like the clinic because when she took me there after my dad beat me, they didn't believe her that we were in danger." She lifted her head, refusing to be ashamed of what her father had done. That wasn't her burden to bear, not anymore. They actually investigated her for child abuse, and my father got to keep hitting both of us. The door opened, and Eloise looked over to find Alice squeezing her way into the car. Eloise scooted over, glad for her friend's presence. She'd thought she was fine, but her lungs vibrated with nerves, and as she blew out, she felt stronger than before. Alice put her arm around her, and Eloise leaned into her, the way they'd always done for one another. "It was years ago," Eloise said. "Tell her that, okay, Aaron? Surely the same nurses aren't there, and she needs to get her leg set or it won't heal right."
I didn't know,
Aaron said over the radio, and Eloise felt the comforting embrace of his warm, strong arms around her. He'd hug her if he was there, she knew.
I'm sorry, El.
"It was a long time ago," she said again, "but that's why she won't go. I suppose she's good at carrying a grudge, too." Aaron blew out his breath and said,
I guess she's entitled to that. Are the girls close enough to the radio? Can I hear their voices too? I'm offended he doesn't want to hear my voice,
Paul joked as he got out of the car.
Come up here, girls.
Billy and Grace piled behind the wheel, and Eloise gazed at them with fondness as they spoke to their dad. Finally, Eloise said, "I know your people are dying for you to tell them what to do now. We'll clear out so you can be the boss."
I love you,
Aaron said.
You girls, too.
We love you, Daddy.
Grace chirped into the radio before Billy had the button all the way depressed. She got it and said, "I love you too, Dad. We'll help Eloise and everyone here until you can get here, okay?"
I know you will, Bills.
Billy handed the radio to Eloise, who pressed the button and said, "I love you, Aaron Sherman. You be careful out there because I need you." Her throat tightened, and her grip on the radio did too. "I need you."
Need you too, El. Love you.
With that, he was gone. Eloise replaced the radio on the clip and followed Alice out of the car. Billy and Grace came around the front of it, and she embraced them, holding them right to her chest the way she had last night. They'd all slept in the same bed last night, with Billy telling them stories of the crazy things Aaron had done with his brothers growing up. Eloise had told them that she'd known their dad in high school, and while they were all scared and worried, it had been a powerful few hours before Grace and Billy couldn't stay awake for another moment. Eloise straightened, and Robin put her hand on her shoulder. "He's okay, Eloise." "Yes," She took a deep breath. He is. She looked at the 3 women watching her, her eyes flitting over to where Laurel stood a few feet away, clearly not wanting to intrude. Eloise gestured her over, and they formed a group as they hugged. "Thank you," Eloise said. "Thank you all for all your help last night and this morning."
I'm thinking of stealing that Officer Leahy, Alice said with a giggle. Did you guys taste those omelets this morning?
She stepped back and smiled at Laurel.
You better hold on to him.
"I'm trying," Laurel said. "Sometimes he feels slippery." She glanced over to him and then to Eloise. "I was a victim of domestic abuse too, Eloise. I work with the 5 Island Cove Women's Support Center, if you or your mother ever need anything." Surprise darted through Eloise, and she felt another plank in the bridge between her and Laurel cementing in place. "Thank you," she said. She met AJ's eyes, and the woman seemed different. Softer somehow. She had one hand pressed against her heart and one resting against her flat stomach. "What about Kelly breaking into a van?" Eloise asked, her eyes going wide again. "I can't wait until she gets here so we can hear that story." "Right?" AJ laughed and looked at her phone. "She still hasn't answered me. I wonder if something happened to her phone."
Kristen won't respond either,
Robin said.
I think radios are the only way to communicate right now. The lighthouse has a radio,
Alice said. "Maybe we can tune one of ours to it," Laurel suggested, her eyebrows lifting. "When they're done with the chief, I'll see what I can figure out."
Thanks for listening to Christmas at the Cove by Jessie Newton, Part 1. Look for Part 2 right here on the Feel Good Fiction audiobook channel.